The lady was taken aback and asked the young man to calm down, since they were both not on the battlefield after all. But he only growled loudly in response. Daylin froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. Daylin was puzzled, because every day she had to fight with a rabid dog. Using her magic, she thus calmed him down. A moment later, he fell on her with a crash. Daylin sighed heavily as she managed to suppress his attack this time too. She congratulated him on how he managed to calm down a few seconds faster than last time. Daylin hoped he would get off her sooner rather than later. But without waiting for this, she pushed him away herself. The lady sighed heavily as she knew that it had all started again. She looked at him intently as he looked at her with puppy dog eyes. Daylin knew he couldn't just say what he wanted, so she wondered what he wanted this time. He muttered quietly that she should be next to him. A moment later, he pulled her closer to him and told her that she needed to stay close. He didn't speak until she asked, but she knew that it was precisely because of this desire that they couldn't get closer. The priestess sighed heavily as she was wondering when the public appearance would take place. Patting him on the back, she said that she would be by his side. She was in shock because she didn't understand why her life had suddenly become like this. Some time ago, she was entrusted with a difficult mission. Daylin knew that holiness was the highest clerical rank in the church where she served. The hierarchy of the clergy of the Church of Rockley is very simple. 7 sons of God, the higher clergy. They owned all the temples and also headed a separate church. Unfortunately, she was not in this hierarchy because she was an ordinary novice. In those days, when she was young and naive, she was filled with happiness and the confidence that she was unworthy of the honor bestowed upon her. But the longer she served at the temple, the more problems appeared, and each day became more and more painful. Unfortunately, she did not have rich parents, and for 7 years she worked herself to the bone. Daylin knew that if she had refused the offer then, she would have avoided the problems. She was puzzled, since she was simply unlucky enough to be born poor. The higher one in the temple gave her a hard job. Daylin was puzzled, because she had a hard time. She smiled and asked if he needed any help. Unfortunately, she had no patrons, and she was given dirty work. Even if she tried to get promoted, she still had no chance. He smiled and said that she would help him if she completed a small task. Daylin was furious because she didn't know what kind of nasty job he was going to dump on her. He smiled and said that all she needed was to help a young gentleman who was suffering from the severe consequences of the war to join the society. She froze in shock, as she knew it was very difficult. Daylin was furious because she hated him, knew nothing about battles and wars, and was afraid of blood. She wished she could tell him that, but it wasn't that simple. He said with a smile that she had already been on the battlefield, so she should have gotten used to it. She said that even if she went now, it was not just about treating the patient. Only those who had been to war knew how it poisoned a person. Simple church servants healed the body and soul of wounded soldiers, but they treated them only until they were able to go into battle again. No one thought about them. She understood that there were not enough people, and if she sent an experienced novice, it meant the situation was quite serious. Daylin understood that there was no way to be saved, and if she failed, all that would remain for her was to die ingloriously. He smiled and said that she needed to give a helping hand to someone who desperately needed it. She said that she could have died. The priest smiled and said that God would grant her endless bliss. In translation, he said that he didn't care whether she died or not. She knew that many years ago she would have agreed without hesitation. Daylin asked, what if it got so bad that she wanted to die? In translation, she asked what she would get in return, because no matter what favorable conditions he offered, she did not want to agree. He smiled, but inside he was burning with rage, since she had not learned humility. They looked at each other intently, smiling sweetly. Daylin smiled, as she didn't mind at all, just leaving the temple silently. The novices themselves were forbidden to accept money. Such were the rules. No matter how hard she tried to get richer, she didn't become richer. Since she grew up in the temple, so she thought that this was how it should be, she was grateful for the warmth and food. But after the novice had been exposed to danger many times on the battlefield, her view of the world changed dramatically. Daylin knew that if she lived her life for a day, working in vain to get by, and then dissolved into nothingness like a grain of sand, not a single living soul would appreciate her efforts. They were born alone and died alone, so now she didn't want to let herself be fooled. He sighed heavily and said that he had watched her for a very long time and knew that she was very talented. He smiled and said that if everything went smoothly this time, then even the highest clergy would certainly recognize her merits. She froze for a moment as she felt her promotion in the air. If everything worked out, then she should have earned a place in the highest hierarchy. She understood that she agreed to such conditions. With a joyful smile, she said that God was leading her, and she would go anywhere if that was his command. With a joyful smile, she asked for permission to begin performing her duties as soon as possible. The priest smiled and said that when he heard her words, he knew she could handle it. He said that she must go immediately and follow the young people's instructions. He said with a wicked smile that the young master who needed her help was the war-winning hero from the 8th Berserker Squad. Dalen froze in shock, as she had not expected this, knowing that this was a man who indiscriminately killed both enemies and friends. The priest smiled and said that he had forgotten to tell her that she must act alone. He smiled and asked her to leave quickly and wished her luck. He said with a smile that he hoped to see her alive and well. She was shocked, because after his words, she just wanted to quit her job and leave. It so happened that on that day she suddenly fell into a trap and had to go to a magnificent estate. But in the beautiful building, a very serious problem awaited her. Unfortunately, she realized that the problem was of enormous proportions and that she could not simply deal with it. After some time, she slowly followed her problem. She was puzzled, as she had only recently returned from the war, but she felt herself being pulled back into hell. Dalen has seen and been through a lot. Unfortunately, she no longer had the strength to cry. In the war between Raklion and the neighboring state of Sorbonne, victory was always on the side of the latter. With each new defeat, the morale of the troops fell, and, unfortunately, no one anymore hoped for victory. The war was dragging on hopelessly. Until the moment they appeared, no one knew who they were or where they came from, because there were only a few selected fighters, who fought like madmen. They had monstrous strength, and due to such strength, they turned the tide of the war. They appeared very unexpectedly and won the battle, and later disappeared without a trace. The Allies called them saviors, and the enemies, demons. She was very grateful to them, and she wanted the bloody war to end sooner. Even if one of her own was hurt, she didn't care. But in one moment, everything changed. Of course, they were cruel in battle, but only because of this they were called animals. But still, thanks to them, they quickly won. The Emperor's second son, the former commander-in-chief, became a hero, and the detachment's existence was consigned to oblivion. Dalen knew that as soon as the war ended, the squad disappeared and their existence was forgotten. The church was ordered to reward them with titles and lands, and not to hide them, but to treat them and prepare them to become knights. The priestess understood that in order to stop one such warrior, 10 knights would be needed. Dalen was furious because she agreed, because she was promised a good reward. The young man looked intently at the priestess and said with a smile that they would arrive at the place soon. He thanked her again for agreeing to come. She smiled and said that she was following God's will. Lauren Truck, third son of House Truck Staff Army officer, a very capable man, but after the war, he was left without work. So now he has been given the role of the one who will solve the squad's problems. He said with a smile that even if it was God's will, it was not an easy decision. She said that she would try her best. He smiled and said that he believed in her, and also said that from now on, she would have to cope with everything alone. He handed her a small whistle with a smile and asked her to keep it with her. She looked at him in surprise, but he said that it was just a precaution and she should use it in case of danger. He also said that with his help, she could calm down their enraged friends. She sighed heavily and thanked him for this gift, which she accepted with joy. Lauren said with a smile that they had arrived at the place. He looked at her intently and, smiling, said that she would live in this mansion. He also talked about how the maids would arrive, how the cleaning would be done, and how the groceries would be delivered. And he also talked about security. She didn't know how the guards could help her. He smiled and said that they could either remove the body or die with her for company. Dalen was shocked and asked if she could leave for the night too. He smiled and said that it was impossible, but since she was already there, he was leaving. The security guards surrounded her with a smile and asked her to help with her luggage. She was in shock, as she understood that life is pain. A moment later, they did not report where the young man was, and wished her luck. She sighed heavily, and looking around, walked inside. She noticed that there was no one inside. She imagined that as soon as she entered, a wild animal would immediately pounce on her. She noticed that there was no wild animal, and the mansion was excellent. Daylin walked slowly and quietly into the room. She looked at her new room with a joyful smile, as she saw that it was luxurious, like the whole house. Before this, she lived in tiny closets, and her room resembled a coffin. She thought that she would live in a terrible kennel as a rabid dog, but the room was very luxurious, which made her immensely happy. Daylin, with a joyful smile, she ran to meet her destiny. She danced and rejoiced, because she knew that life is beautiful. Overjoyed, she opened the door and walked into the room with Pesnya. But a moment later, she stood frozen in place. At the same time, the young man gave her a fierce and menacing look. She froze in shock, and all her joy disappeared somewhere. A moment later, she looked at the young man with a glare and a frown. Daylin knew she had to remain calm, because when someone encountered a wild animal, they couldn't show their fear. With a heavy sigh, she greeted the lost soul. But at that very moment, the young man attacked her with fury. She realized that he didn't like the phrase. It was too dazzling. Looking at the young man, she could not understand whether he was sensible or not. She knew that if the muscle mass attacked her, she would definitely be dead. But she also noticed that he had stopped growling. Daylin knew she needed to try to talk to him, because she needed to understand how sane he was. But before he could even get the word out, she saw him pounce on her. The priest was in shock, as she did not expect everything to happen so quickly. But at that very moment, she took advantage of her recent gift. The young man screamed in pain as he was bound by magic. She whistled without stopping, and the young man fell to the ground with a crash. After a few seconds, she finally opened her eyes. She froze for a moment when she saw that he was simply lying on the ground. Daylin was in shock and didn't understand what had happened. She didn't understand what she had done. For a moment, it seemed to her that he was not breathing, but she still hoped that he was not dead and tried to wake him up. Daylin pulled away from him as she realized she was sitting next to the man who had almost killed her. But after a few minutes, she plucked up her courage and approached him. She hoped that he was not dead. She was in shock because she understood that if he really died, she could be fired, and in that case, she would become a murderer. A moment later, she clearly saw marks on his neck, as if someone had tightened ropes around his neck. She knew they weren't there before. Daylin was taken aback because she realized that it was all because of the whistle. She saw that he fell unconscious, but did not squeak. Daylin sighed heavily because he looked so creepy, so she decided not to use the whistle anymore. She didn't know what to do, so she decided to make him more comfortable. It seemed to her that because of the strong muscles in his back, his head was floating in the air. She decided to take care of him a little, and brought him a pillow so that he would be a little more comfortable. Daylin sighed heavily as she saw that he hadn't even moved, but she understood that if he was snoring, it meant he was alive. So she wanted to rest a little until he woke up. But after a few seconds, she saw a fresh wound. Daylin was shocked because she was again meddling in things that weren't her business by being too kind. She understood that she simply had no way out, and so she decided to help him. Daylin climbed on top of the young man and unbuttoned his shirt. She was momentarily taken aback by the beautiful sight. She wondered if the body was a murder weapon or a washboard, but she didn't understand why there was no living spot on it. She hoped that he would keep his mouth shut and not blab about her stupidity, so she used her power on the young man. As a child, she noticed that her gift was special. She understood that there was no one to protect her, and if someone found out about her outstanding abilities, they would start using her, so she carefully hid her gift. It would have taken an ordinary church minister half a day to heal such wounds, but she did it all in a matter of minutes. Looking at the young man, she wondered how he had been eating all this time. A moment later, the young man opened his eyes wide as he woke up from everything that had happened. The young people froze for a moment in surprise. But at that very moment, he suddenly rose up. Unfortunately, he miscalculated the strength of his lift and dealt a strong blow to the priest. She sighed heavily, but a moment later she shouted that she had done nothing of the sort. Daylin was furious and screamed that she only took off her clothes to heal him, so he shouldn't look at her like that. She was furious and screamed at him to stop making that face immediately, as if he had lost something. She was glad that his mind had returned so much that he now felt ashamed. She sighed heavily and said that she was not finished with his treatment, so he should sit quietly. She warned that it would not hurt him. The young man froze for a moment in surprise when he saw how she used her power against him. She smiled and asked if he had relaxed. She understood that his outburst of anger was a sign of severe overexcitement. She was sure that with the help of divine power, she would be able to calm him down. She smiled and asked if he could stand her voice. He sighed heavily and said that he could. A moment later, she asked him with a smile what his name was. He replied, surprised, that his name was Kels. She said that his name was very beautiful, and also asked who gave it to him. He did not know. Looking at the young man, she asked if he often lost his temper like that. She sighed heavily as she realized that he did not understand the question. A few seconds later, her stomach began to rumble, and she became wary as she realized he didn't like the sound. She smiled and said that she seemed a little hungry. Dalen said with a smile that the train would go so that her stomach wouldn't growl. She smiled and asked if he wanted anything, as she could bring food and they could have dinner together. He said in surprise that he would like to have dinner. She suggested that he sit on the sofa while she brought everything. A moment later, the young man obediently walked towards the sofa. She looked at him with a smile, because it turned out better than she thought. When she left the room, she smelled a pleasant aroma and thought that someone had cooked them dinner. At that moment, unfortunately, she still did not know what awaited her. The young lady smiled and said that she had been informed that the priestess had arrived at the mansion and that she must have met him now. Looking at her son, she said that he seemed to be really looking forward to the meeting. She knew that her son wanted to know what kind of hero the squad would become. But after a while, the young lady froze in shock and trembled with fear. She was shocked and, looking at the young man, wondered how great the malice that surrounded him was. Dalen rushed to her new acquaintance in a hurry, as she saw a lot of blood on him. She screamed that she would remove the poison right now. But she had never done anything like that before. She was taken aback and breathed a sigh of relief, since it was just juice, and she thought that someone had poisoned it. She smiled and asked for forgiveness because she was scared, but she froze when she saw his angry and bestial gaze. She understood that he was going to kill her. She was in shock because she understood that this time she would die for real. She was trembling with fear and praying to God. She was shocked because she knew she couldn't just die since she hadn't used all her money. But he just looked at her intently and started talking about poison. Dalen looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. He looked at her coldly and said angrily that all food is poison. Dalen asked Kels if he was okay. She didn't understand how he knew about the poison. Kels said it was the taste. Dalen breathed a sigh of relief as she was unable to eat a single bite because he started devouring the food. She was puzzled as she realized that he ate like an animal. She sighed heavily and asked if there was nothing she could eat. He quickly replied that there was nothing edible for her. Dalen was puzzled because she knew she had many options for death. Dalen, for her part, knew she needed to stay calm because as long as she remained alert, she could survive. Dalen looked at the gentleman intently and said with a smile that he should trust her. She looked at him with a mischievous smile and said that she would show him something. He looked at her in bewilderment as she ran away in a hurry. Kels froze and looked after the young lady with bewilderment. At the same time, Dalen ran into the kitchen and looked closely at the food. She understood that there was definitely no poison in the carrots, potatoes, and flour. The knight told the lady that he had brought what she had asked for, but he also asked if it was really enough, as there were no seasonings. He said that he had also contacted the Lord, and that he would appear soon. She smiled and thanked him. Dalen sighed heavily, as she didn't know if there was anything she could do at all. She wondered when the last time you tried cooking was. After all, her only experience was helping around the house before she joined the temple. All she knew was that vegetables needed to be washed, and soup needed to be stirred. She understood that no matter how much she screwed up, all the ingredients would still turn into delicious soup. She looked at the products with joy, as she wanted to get to work immediately. With lightning speed, the young lady directed her sharp knife towards the food. Some time later, the lord of the gate ran into the kitchen with rapiers and asked the priestess what had happened. He was furious and asked if someone had killed someone or if someone was on the brink of life and death again. Dalen told the lord to speak more quietly because Mr. Mad Dog was in a bad mood because he had not eaten. She said she needed to discuss something, and he also came even quickly. Lord said that he was worried that something from the above had happened. She said that she would not have called him and would have just run away. But now she wanted to see him for another reason. A moment later, she turned around and went to the stove, realizing that something had burned. Lauren looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she was up to. He smiled and asked if she was into cursing. She sighed heavily and said that she wasn't, and it was just dinner. He smiled and said he was mistaken because it was too small and cute to be just dinner. She said it was better than poison in food. She also said that the gentleman had caught the bird for her. Lauren looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She smiled and said that she tried to cook something from the ingredients that were in the kitchen. A few hours ago, she was slowly walking towards the young master. She was worried because she had been preparing the soup for too long, and she suggested that the young gentleman might have gone crazy from the city. She understood that it was a miracle that he was calm all the time. Daylane smiled and told the gentleman that she had tried boiling the tooth, but she wasn't sure he would like it. Daylane froze for a moment, looking at the young man who held the candlestick in his hand. Daylane froze and stared at him for a moment, guessing that he looked like a noble gentleman. She knew he looked good even in his shabby state. She understood that he was about to make his debut, and therefore he had to control his rage. But with the speed of lightning, he turned and threw the candlestick at a dove that was flying past. The dove flew to the ground with a crash. He turned around and, looking at his companion, said that it was food. She froze in shock, as she knew he was very amazing, but also aggressive at the same time. She said she thought he wanted meat, so she cooked it again, and the Lord smiled and said they seemed to be getting along very well. The Lord said that the young man would eventually become a noble gentleman, and he waited very hard until the new day. She was puzzled, knowing he had left his conscience at home, but he smiled and said that the right balance between life and work was very important to him. She envied him and said that he should let her know when his conscience returned. The Lord smiled and said that she should not be upset. Since her progress so far had already impressed him, he hoped that she would live up to their expectations, as he understood that there would be no problems when Charlotte came to visit. She looked at him in surprise and asked who would be coming and for what visit. The Lord smiled and said that he seemed to have forgotten to tell her about it. Sebian would soon be coming to visit them. He said with a joyful smile that they were very interested in the young gentleman. At that moment, her world collapsed. Charlotte is a very mysterious girl, but not for everyone. The current Emperor Raklion had 2 wives. When the first empress died, his mistress Penelia became the second. However, his love for Penelia did not last long, and soon the emperor became infatuated with another woman. It was the beautiful Charlotte. The emperor treasured her so much that even though the current empress is still alive, the people nicknamed Charlotte the third empress. It is well known that the emperor favored Charlotte and her son Sebian. Daylane could already imagine herself and her son coming to visit the mad dog. She was in shock because she understood that she could not avoid the worst. She was in shock and did not understand how this was possible. Daylane was furious because she knew that if anything went wrong, she would be held responsible and executed. The Lord asked her to calm down, as he knew that the emperor valued them highly, and they would arrive prepared. Daylane, she sighed heavily and said she would be concerned. But that wasn't the point. He smiled and said that, unfortunately, he couldn't protect her from the poisonous goo she had just made. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really going to force the young man to eat such soup. She said that the soup didn't look very good, but she couldn't force him to eat the poisoned food, because all the dishes that were served had poison in them. He said that such accidents were quite common. A moment later, they looked closely at the soup. The Lord was a little surprised, as the soup resembled the spawn of Satan. He picked up the pot to get rid of the dish as quickly as possible, but the lady stopped him, as she had no more food left. He was shocked and screamed that she could easily give the young man just poison. She screamed that he didn't even try her soup, but he shouted that there were things in this world that made everything clear if you just looked at them. She screamed with tears in her eyes that he did not die even after he ate poison, and this was her first meal of the day. He shouted that she could eat the bird she had cooked. He looked at the bird in surprise and asked if it was really her divine power that raised the dead. Lauren said he would send her the groceries and the cookbook, and then they should throw out the soup. She still agreed with him, but after a few seconds, they heard a terrible roar. They froze for a moment when they saw the mad dog in all its glory. He looked at them with cold fury and said that he would like to taste his food. He shouted that they must provide him with food immediately. The young people froze for a moment. After some time, something resembling food was visible in front of him. But with the speed of lightning, he seized his food and began to eat. The young people froze in shock as he ate everything. Dalen asked with a surprised smile if her dish was already delicious. But he didn't answer and continued eating. A moment later, she looked at him in bewilderment as he held out his hand and asked for more. Dalen was taken aback and said that she would bring him everything right away. Lauren looked at the priestess with hope and faith because he thought that the Lord was really watching over her. Lauren looked at the young man and asked what kind of poison was in the food. Kels answered with lightning speed what kind of poisons were in the food. The young lady was surprised that the young man could distinguish poisons. Lauren smiled and said that in the squad, young people can distinguish poisons. She was surprised and wondered if they were trained. She saw all his reactions. Lauren said that they were trained, of course, but some of it was from birth. But also different spells were used on them during training. She knew that all invisible forces were considered divine. They were controlled by the church. With the exception of the fighting priests, the rest could only use the powers for salvation. She was shocked because they used a spell to turn children into weapons. She asked if the church was involved in this. The Lord was taken aback, but a moment later asked if she really wanted to know. She froze, and at that very moment, the young man took the pot of food from her. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't want to know, but at the same time, the young man continued to eat with appetite. Trembling with fear, she said that she did not want to know anything like that, because the less you know, the better you sleep. Dalen Bailiff looked at the Lord and said that she was a simple novice, and she did everything she was told. He said that when the children of the squad were growing up, they did not make mistakes, and there were no losers among them. He said that there are many ways to erase a person, as if he never existed. He smiled and said he hoped everything would be okay. Taken aback, the young lady said that everything would, of course, be fine, and she would not let him down. Sometime later, the young lady also stared at the young man who was leaving the estate. She was a little puzzled by his words. Turning around, she sighed heavily, knowing it had been a very long day. After seeing a mad dog eating the food she had prepared, she decided to try it, but it turned out to be no better than poison. He gave it away in a hurry and simply ran away from them, wishing them a bon appetit. The Lord was in shock and shouted after her that he needed her healing and blessing. She sighed heavily and lay down on her bed. She assumed that her ward had most likely fallen asleep after dinner, as the house was very quiet. She knew he wasn't going to die, so she didn't need to worry, and it was time to go to bed. A moment later, she wrapped herself in a beautiful blanket and began to drift off to sleep with pleasure. Dalen knew that even though she hadn't eaten very well, she would sleep well. She hoped that tomorrow she would be able to sleep late. She told herself this without realizing that there was anyone nearby. But a moment later, she felt someone's presence and jumped up abruptly. She was shocked when she saw Mr. Mad Dog in front of her. She turned around as if she had already fallen asleep and was just dreaming about him. But after a few seconds, she finally took out a small whistle and looked intently at the young man. At the same time, he growled at her fiercely and loudly. Dalen sighed as she realized that the whistle had worked, and he had actually been afraid of it. She hoped that she would not have to use it. Looking at the young man, she asked us if something had happened. He didn't answer her, and she realized that he was simply holding back because he saw the whistle. Looking at the priestess, he said very loudly. She asked in surprise what he was talking about. Kel said irritably that all the sounds were very loud, and he couldn't sleep because he could hear the voice and breathing steps. She was taken aback and froze for a moment in shock. But after a few seconds, she said that she understood everything. She didn't think at all that he would be able to explain anything to her, and she asked for forgiveness because she was carried away by the situation. But after a few seconds, she was taken aback because she knew that they were in different rooms, and they were far from each other. She asked in surprise if he could really hear her steps and breathing from his room. He said that it was true and that she was very loud. She was taken aback as she remembered what the Lord had told her. She knew he was sensitive, but this was going beyond all bounds. She knew that if she told him to go to his room and sleep, he wouldn't do it. Looking at the young man, I realized that he would not do it. A moment later, she said that she couldn't sleep either, so they could just talk. Dalen asked the young man to sit down as she wanted to make him some tea. She pushed back her chair and looked at him intently as he walked leisurely toward the table. Dalen looked at the young man in surprise. As he sat up straight and looked like a museum exhibit, Dalen noticed that there was some tea left that she had brewed earlier, but it had cooled down quite a bit. She sighed heavily and said that it didn't bother her at all. She slowly handed him a small teapot and asked him not to be surprised. A moment later, the teapot began to shine dazzlingly, and the young man looked at the teapot in surprise. He asked if she was a battle priest, and Dalen gasped and said she wasn't. Priests were divided into several types. Ordinary priests entered the priesthood after completing theological training. Natural-born priests were born with their divine power. They were found and made priests. War priests had special divine abilities and participated in battles. Usually, divine power is the power of healing, but sometimes it could manifest as telekinesis or the power of fire. Dalen smiled and said that she didn't want to die early, so she asked him to keep this secret. She didn't think he would tell anyone, but by sharing the secret, she could establish some kind of connection with him. A moment later, the young man drank the tea with lightning speed. She was shocked, and at that very moment, she started shooting him, just like he got burned. Dalen sighed heavily and asked the young man to take his time and drink slowly. She smiled and said that this way, he should enjoy the smell and taste of the tea while he drank it. Dalen was an ordinary novice until one day her divine powers manifested, but this led to an increased workload. So she doubted that her life would be better if she told about her special power. She looked closely at the young man, as she knew that he had gone through training and risked his life to participate in the war. She froze in embarrassment as she realized that he was left with only a sexy body. She was taken aback and decided to throw all thoughts away. Dalen smiled and said that it was okay. She was just lost in thought because it was dark, and she decided to light a candle. She was puzzled and decided that perhaps she shouldn't have lit the fire, since he was so sensitive. Dalen asked if she should blow out the candle, but he didn't answer. Kells, in turn, sipped his tea in silence. She noticed that he seemed more relaxed now, so she asked if he was feeling better. He said he relaxed a little, and she felt relieved, and also asked if he heard any other sounds besides her voice. A moment later, he listed to her all the birds on the street, and what each one did, about the mice, about the guards' shift changes. She was in shock. But he said he was just practicing. Dalen was puzzled, as she knew he might go crazy if he heard everything. Dalen looked at the young man closely, as she understood why he was so angry with her. She knew he might feel better if she covered his ears. Dalen slowly reached out to the young man, but saw his anger. Dalen sighed heavily as she realized she was very tired and had been thinking about something else. She said with a smile that it must be very hard for him, so she could help him. He looked at her in bewilderment, but she realized that there had to be a way to help him, and so she decided to do everything in her power. She asked how he usually spends his time. Kel said that he trains, and also sleeps, and also eats. The next morning, the young lady woke up and was not in the best shape. Last night, he calmed down after they talked a little. She signed him with divine power and sent him back to bed. Dalen was puzzled because she hadn't been able to sleep at all since he left. She understood that it was simply impossible to fall asleep, since he could hear her every breath. At first, she was worried about being almost poisoned, and now she had to worry about not breathing too loudly in her sleep. A moment later, she closed her mouth, for she knew that he was also awake, and that, driven mad by the sounds, he might come running to her. She sighed heavily, knowing she should just go and quietly make breakfast. But a moment later, she was taken aback, as she heard young people outside the window who were behaving very loudly. They happily discussed who lived in the big house that was deep in the forest. They thought that some sick lady or bastard lived in the house. She was shocked and didn't know what to do, because she knew they were being very loud. They knew they had to be careful in places where such secrets were kept. The man looked at his friend and asked if he had heard the crackling sound of some animal nearby. At that moment, Kels flew at the men, looking at them with fury. Some time ago, the men walked carefree along the path, intending to deliver groceries. To their regret, they ignored the words of their employer. and went happily and had fun. She understood that the unhappy fate of immature workers awaited them. At that moment, a black shadow hung over them, and at that very moment, the young lady threw herself out of the window in order to stop the young gentleman and save the workers. She was in shock because she didn't understand why she jumped out of the window. After all, she could have simply blown the whistle in her room and thus stopped him. As this thought crossed her mind, she clearly saw him running towards her. At that very moment, he managed to catch her. Unfortunately, the young lady J fell with a crash on the young gentleman. The men were shocked. They didn't understand why she suddenly jumped out of the window, because they knew that it was very dangerous. But she only looked at them with fury. A moment later, she jumped up and asked if they had forgotten everything they had been warned about. She screamed at them to run away right now. They looked at her in bewilderment and said that they had come simply to drop off the boxes and that this was their job. She screamed furiously that she was saying this for their own good, so they should just run away. She screamed that if they didn't want to lose their lives now, they had to leave immediately. The men stopped when they saw the young man. They were taken aback because he looked at them very angrily and aggressively. But at that very moment, they, with the speed of lightning, ran away, as they realized at the cost of their lives. A few seconds later, they were sitting in complete silence on the ground. Daylin sighed heavily, as she was glad that they had listened to her and left. But a moment later, she was taken aback, as she realized that the mad dog was sitting next to her. Daylin smiled and thanked the gentleman for being able to save her. But in turn, he looked at her with fury and growled. He wanted to go to the men and deal with them, but she caught him and asked him to calm down. She was shocked because he didn't hear her and wondered if she should use the whistle. But a moment later, she froze and looked intently at the young gentleman, as her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. She stared at his beautiful body, but she noticed that he was worried, and therefore slowly pulled away from him. Daylin looked at the gentleman and said that everything was fine and that they had just brought the groceries. She said that they were safe because the men had already left. Daylin noticed that he was calming down, and her words were helping, so she asked if he wanted to go to my room and rest. She knew he would have been dead by now if he hadn't reacted immediately when he sensed danger. She knew that was the only way he was still alive. Daylin looked at him with a tender smile, as she understood that her task was to teach him to live in peacetime. She wanted to treat him like a normal person to help him become one. Daylin said with a smile that he did a great job of holding himself back. In any case, she was very glad that she dealt with this situation, as she reacted to something like this very quickly. But at the same time, they slowly approached the door, and she noticed how the guard sighed heavily and yawned. They had just started work, but were puzzled because they had overslept. Daylin looked at the men closely and called out to them. She smiled and said that they must have slept well. Daylin looked at the men, explained what had happened, and received their sincere apologies. Some time later, they came to the young master's room. Daylin, with a smile, asked him to lie down on the bed. Kells, in turn, looked intently at the girl, with bewilderment on his face. She looked at him, puzzled, as she saw that he simply froze in place. A few seconds later, she approached him and slowly led him to the sleeping place. A few seconds later, she put him to bed and was glad that he obediently lay down in bed. She smiled and said that today she would be treating him in the back, so he should turn over. She realized that she needed to use more gestures. A moment later, he said coldly that he was uncomfortable. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was saying. After a few seconds, she gently turned his head and said with a smile that it would be more comfortable for him. But he sighed heavily and said that he was uncomfortable. She was surprised and turning him around, asked if he was comfortable. He sighed heavily and said that the floor was comfortable. Daylin asked with a smile if he wasn't used to a soft bed. She said it was because he hadn't slept on it much, and he would be much more comfortable if he just got used to it. Daylin looked at the young man closely and said that this was not a battlefield at all, and he did not need to be on guard all the time. He did not answer her, but she said that his body became softer when he relaxed, and this was called a state of comfort. Daylin looked at him tenderly and said that from now on, he should learn to catch this feeling. She realized that he was not answering difficult questions, so she needed to fix that urgently. She froze for a moment and wondered what it meant to be a young master. She knew that all the aristocrats she had seen before were vile scum. Daylane sighed heavily, because she knew she shouldn't turn him into someone like that. She assumed they wanted to turn him into the sweet and kind person that all the girls dreamed of. Daylane sighed heavily, knowing she had a long way to go. A moment later, the young lady saw that he was sleeping peacefully. She hoped not to rush things and start by sleeping on the bed. Daylin Q was glad that her charge had finally fallen asleep, so she went to the kitchen with lightning speed. She knew it was time to feed the muscle mass. Sometime later, the young lady was no longer alone in the kitchen. She looked at her new friend with a smile and said that they could start cooking. She had not expected him to wake up so quickly. She brought him into the kitchen so that he could see if there was any poison in the food. And she also noticed that he was in a good mood after his morning sleep and treatment. She was even a little ashamed to use him as a bloodhound, because she needed to make an aristocrat out of him, but she wanted to use every opportunity to survive. She smiled and said that all he had to do was check if there was poison in the food. She slowly showed him each product, and he determined by smell whether they contained poison. With a joyful smile, she said that the products were all fine. Looking at the recipe book, she wondered what to eat, because she knew that the guards had brought more boxes, and now they had a lot of food. She was glad, because the Lord thoughtfully presented them with a whole box, which was filled with cookbooks. Daylin, after reading for a short time, she closed the book because she didn't understand anything. She wondered if the cookbook was in a foreign language. She knew it was very strange because she could read and wrote excellent explanatory notes. A few minutes later, she invited her companion to look at this book. Kels looked at the book intently. She wondered if he had actually understood the dash, as he was focused on looking at the book. She smiled and asked if he was curious, and also asked if he wanted to see what was inside. But a moment later, he, like the bloodhound, said that there was no poison. She sighed heavily as she realized that he was just doing his job. Daylin handed him the book and said that, fortunately, there was no poison in it, but with a smile asked why he didn't take a look at our holding. He looked at the book in bewilderment. She was a little surprised. Daylin sighed heavily and, looking at the young man, asked if he really couldn't read. She was shocked because she understood that he had been trained, but they hadn't taught him to read. He dryly replied that it wasn't necessary for combat. Daylin was shocked and didn't understand how they could have raised children like that. She didn't understand who even thought it was a good idea, and at the same time, she wondered why she was the one dealing with the consequences now. Daylin looked at the young man closely and said that it looked like she would have to teach him to read. He looked at her with confusion, as the word was new to him. Daylin asked in confusion if he didn't want to learn to read, and all she heard in response was dead silence. She was surprised because he didn't say anything, but he wasn't angry either, so she wondered if he had thought this through. She realized that he had only responded with insignificant words before, so she assumed that he didn't know what he liked and what he didn't. Daylin knew she needed to teach him to understand his feelings. In addition to reading and sleeping on the bed, she smiled and said that all noble aristocrats could read, so he should learn too. Daylin sighed heavily and said that he couldn't become a master if he died of hunger, so now she needed to feed him. A moment later, she asked him to start by cutting the onion and carrot into small pieces. She glanced sideways at the young man and asked if he knew what that meant. He dryly replied that he did. She looked at him in surprise, but a moment later said with a smile that it made sense, since he had been trained to butcher people. She smiled and asked if he wanted to try. Kels looked closely at the food, but said nothing. With lightning speed, he took the knife in his hands and looked at it intently. At the same time, the young lady looked at him dumbfounded, as she was a little scared. She was trembling with fear, as she had completely forgotten that the man was himself a man of weapons. She was in shock, as she had told him that this was not a battlefield, but she herself had given him a knife in his hands. She knew she needed to last longer, so she needed to prepare to run. She clearly understood that life was more valuable to her. A moment later, he glared at the vegetables, but after a few seconds, he moved on to chopping vegetables. The young lady, in turn, looked at the young man with admiration and wondered if this was really art on his part. She felt like she caught a glimpse of technology that had not yet come into this world. She felt like she saw the human future. She realized that not everyone can cut into small pieces. A moment later, he told her that everything was ready and she jumped in surprise. Daylin smiled and praised him for his excellent work, and also said that it was quite a performance on his part, so she was eager to see the vegetables. But a moment later, she froze with a look of bewilderment on her face as she saw only mashed vegetables. She looked at the vegetables with confusion, since she had asked him to simply cut them into small pieces, but she assumed that was not what the book meant. She sighed heavily and asked where he had used his skills before. He said that he did everything right, as he used his skills to capture and torture his enemies. The young lady stood there for a moment, looking at the young man in bewilderment. She was not glad that she had already asked such a question, but in turn, she prayed for the onions and carrots, since they left this world too late. Daylin knew it was best for her not to think about things like that, so she just wanted to focus on feeding herself and the young man, so she didn't want to worry about anything else. She said with a smile that next he should cut the meat and add oil to the pan. She clearly understood that she just needed to get through the day. Sometime later, they looked with admiration at their first dish. She was happy because the dish looked very appetizing and had a pleasant aroma. She was delighted because she had not smelled anything like it for a long time. Daylin looked at the young man with a smile, because she understood that everything worked out because he helped her. She could not have imagined before that the kitchen needed so much dexterity, endurance, and strength. Daylin looked at the young man tenderly and called him. She smiled and asked what he thought about the cooking. She wanted to know if he liked it. He thought for a moment and said that it was not difficult. She smiled and asked if he was having fun. He looked at her in bewilderment because he didn't understand what she was talking about. Daylin V sighed heavily as she was puzzled because she did not know how to explain the meaning of the word fun. She asked if he enjoyed the process of cooking itself, although she realized that she told him and he did everything. And, most likely, he did not enjoy it. She smiled and asked if he wanted to help her cook in the kitchen again in the future. He looked at her with bewilderment and asked if he really needed to do things like that again. Daylin smiled and said that if he wanted to, he could do it. But if not, he didn't need to. She smiled and said that he shouldn't force himself to do things like that, and perhaps she would become a better cook with practice. He looked at her intently and said he wanted to do it again. She smiled a puzzled smile and said that she would look forward to his next dish. She knew that he had genuinely said that he liked it, but for some reason she was upset. Daylin smiled and thanked him for his help and said that he would set the table for us, and so he should bring their dish. The dish was delicious, despite a slightly bitter aftertaste. Sometime later, Daylin talked to Kelsion and asked him what he liked and what he didn't like, naming different objects. After a few minutes, she looked at him intently and asked if he liked her. Kels froze for a moment and stared at the young lady. After a few seconds, he sighed heavily and rudely told her that he didn't like her. She was furious and understood that he was just a rude dog. She was shocked and knew he was just hopeless. She didn't understand how he could respond so quickly without thinking. She knew that even dogs showed their love to those who cared for them. She was shocked and asked her charge why she was eating. Kels looked at her coldly and said that she was noisy. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she had not expected to hear anything like that. But a moment later, she looked away from him, as she realized that it was no wonder he thought she was noisy. Daylin had nearly died several times in her sleep because she snored and ground her teeth every night. She was furious because she knew she couldn't do anything about it, because she was sleeping restlessly due to fatigue. Daylin screamed that she hadn't been snoring or grinding her teeth much lately. He sighed heavily and said that she was still noisy. Daylin was puzzled, as she understood that the young man was a fairly quick learner, but she still hadn't thought about what to do with his increased sensitivity. Daylin was well aware that he looked ready to make his debut in high society, judging by the way he cut his steak alone. She understood that the fact that he had learned to tolerate sounds more easily did not mean that they did not irritate him. She knew that he could hardly stand the sounds that she made alone in a quiet place. She understood that he would not have been able to stand a banquet. Daylin was in shock. She didn't understand how her breathing could bother him. She screamed that she was not his enemy, and he should understand this, because she did not walk around with a knife in her bosom and did not try to cut his throat, but he kept saying that she was noisy. She screamed that she needed to breathe to live. Daylin froze for a moment, as she saw that his gaze spoke volumes about what he thought of her. Dalen asked him if he liked cats. Kels said he didn't like them. She listed puppies, birds, pigs, cows, but he kept saying he didn't like them. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really hated all animals. Kels thought for a moment, and after a few seconds he said that he didn't like them all. The young lady was puzzled. She sighed heavily because he did not love anything, and this annoyed her very much. So she said that from now on she would not breathe. She understood perfectly well that someday she would wait until he said that he liked her. Kels, in turn, glanced sideways out the window. A few seconds later, he caught a small leaf that fell towards them through the window. Lady smiled and said that it was a leaf, and also asked if he would fight with the leaf. It sighed heavily and looked intently into the distance. He looked at her, but a moment later, he looked away as his heart was beating very hard. Dalen looked closely at the young man and asked if he remembered what to do to calm down. He sighed heavily and thought about the little leaf. Dalen, looking into the distance, said that the young man was now calming down faster, and she called him a good boy. But he, in turn, sat quietly in one place, without flinching or uttering a word. He knew that she always made sounds when she moved or slept soundly, but now he really felt something that he had never felt before. He knew it was different from the calm that was forced upon him by drugs and spells on the battlefield. Kels knew it was nothing like having everything taken from him and thrown into an endless void. Kels knew he didn't need to get rid of the sounds because they weren't threatening him at all. He looked closely at the small bird outside the window. He sighed heavily, as he clearly felt peace, and he liked it very much. Dalen was very angry and confused because she had been sitting in one place for a long time without making a sound, and she had lost track of time. Unfortunately, her legs were numb. She was confused because she did not understand why she was sitting on her knees at all. Dalen decided that if she served him as a maid, he would behave more noble, that in this case, he would gradually get used to giving orders and demanding respectful treatment. But she still froze in place because she did not understand why she had to be a maid. Dalen knew that noble society was based on hierarchy, and she was, after all, the daughter of a baron. She was furious because she knew that the young man was not a nobleman at all. Dalen sighed heavily and told the young man that she actually came from a noble family. He looked at her in confusion as he did not understand what she was talking about. She suddenly shouted out loud that she didn't need to speak to him respectfully. He looked at her intently and agreed frankly. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected this. Dalen asked, puzzled, if he really didn't mind. Dalen looked at the young man closely and said that his expression said she didn't need to ask again. She looked at him happily and said that from now on she would speak to him informally. They stared at each other for a moment without saying a word. Dalen was taken aback as she realized that it was more awkward than she thought. She sighed heavily as she didn't know what to say at all. Dalen knew how to address the young man, wondering if she should stop calling him Mr. Kels. She stared at him for a moment, going over different options in her head. She knew that simply calling him by his name would be the best option. A few seconds later, she called his name with a joyful smile. He froze in shock on the spot, as he was very angry, so he looked at her sullenly. Dalen looked at the young man in confusion, as his reaction was completely different. She was shocked, as he had previously said that he did not mind her speaking to him informally. Dalen thanked the knights for their work. The knight said with a smile that they were just doing their job and delivering various goods. The young man looked at her closely and asked how the young gentleman the saint was taking care of was doing. They wanted to know if he was no longer having fits like he used to. They were puzzled because they knew that he had a hard time running a place like this without servants. Dalen just smiled at the young people because they thought that Kels was just an aristocrat who had nervous fits. Dalen said with a gentle smile that she would be glad if she could, as a servant of God, ease the suffering of the needy. They looked at her with admiration because they knew that she was a true saint. They looked at the young lady intently and asked her to forgive them for their insolence, but still they asked if she could give them her blessing. She looked at them in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. A blessing is when a simple greeting is given a little added holy power. Having felt a little holy power, people did not experience any special effect. They simply became blessed. Yet people considered it a great fortune to receive a blessing. So many begged for blessings from priests on the battlefield, even when T was on the verge of exhaustion. She was already used to dealing with this in an adult manner, and happily said that she would bless them. The young people looked at the young priest with delight, as they knew that she was merciful. She smiled and said she would do it for just a few silver coins. They looked at her with bewilderment, as they did not expect such a thing. Dalen looked at the young people with a satisfied smile, as they seemed to have such a face that they could not imagine such a thing. They were in shock, as this service was paid. Dalen knew she couldn't show her weakness here. Religion was faith, and the more confident she was, the more trust she inspired. Dalen said with a satisfied smile that the new power was given to her to serve this world, but she only had one body, and she could only give it to those who stood before her. She smiled and said that this was the reason she healed them, and she said that the money given would go around in circles and allow her to serve even more people. She said that these silver coins were just the will of God. They were shocked because they realized what was going on. She knew that it was complete nonsense. She knew that even if it was a lie, the priest's skillful speech could turn it into the word of God. Priests naturally became eloquent due to low pay and hard work. She thus asked them to accept the will of God. They looked at the priestess with admiration. Dalen looked at them with a smile and said that it was a wonderful choice. She knew that she had not charged enough for something like this before. A moment later, she quietly said that today they were lucky and she would take the assignments. They looked at her with a smile, as they were glad that she took less than they expected. Dalen looked at the young people with a gentle smile and said that from now on, their whole life would go well, and the blessing of the Lord would always be with them. They looked at her with joy, as their fatigue, which had accumulated over the past few days, went away in a matter of minutes. Dalen knew that there was no such effect, but she really gave away the holy power. She knew that, thanks to the effect, their health improved and their faces became fresher, and also love and luck would increase. She smiled and, leaving, said that it was time for her to go. They happily thanked her for this. They said that they would live without forgetting to thank God. They said that they would definitely fulfill God and regularly go to church for services. She understood perfectly well that there was a small side effect, but she did not tell them about it. She prayed to God for forgiveness since she had risked her life at work. Dalen sighed heavily, knowing that yesterday she had faced a life-threatening situation over a trifle. It all started with the fact that she had flared up over a trifle and called her ward by a different name. She remembered his furious gaze and complete silence. Dalen looked at her new friend in surprise and asked if there had been any problems. He looked away from her. She looked at him in bewilderment. Dalen was a little taken aback as he said his name. He sighed heavily and asked her to repeat his name. Dalen sighed heavily and said that he didn't seem to mind. She asked if he was surprised and wondered if this was the first time he had been called by his first name. But he didn't answer and slowly got out of bed. Dalen looked at him in surprise and asked where he was going. Kel sighed heavily and said that he didn't like the bed, and with that, he sat down on the ground. She was taken aback, but said that she understood. She smiled and said that it seemed that no one in the squad had ever called him so familiarly, so she said with a smile that if she called him that more often, he would get used to it. Looking at the young man, she said his name several times. He sighed heavily and asked her to say the name again. She looked at him in surprise, but still said his name several times. But a moment later, she looked at him in bewilderment as he leaned over and laid his head on her lap. Kells looked at the young lady closely and asked her to say the name again. She said his name over and over again, as it wasn't enough for him. But a moment later, she looked at him with a tender smile, as his behavior made her laugh. Dalen looked at him with a tender smile and said that he looked just like a puppy who had brought slippers for the first time. But a moment later, she was taken aback, as she had said too much. Dalen was shocked because she realized that he was not in the mood now after her words. After all, they usually called him a mad dog, and she was very worried that he could decide that a puppy is an insult. She understood that she should not laugh loudly, because this could also alert him and spoil his mood. But a moment later, the young lady was taken aback and looked at her new friend in bewilderment, as he was behaving unpredictably. But he, in turn, looked at her intently, and told her to continue. Dalen looked at him in confusion and called his name. But he said that was not it. And at the same time he reached for her face. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really just talked about laughter. Kels. He said that was exactly it. Looking at the young lady, he asked her to smile again. She was puzzled because she knew that if someone had told her that she had to laugh on command, she would not have been able to do so. But the young lady knew perfectly well that she had no choice, and she laughed hysterically. Kels looked at her with a displeased expression on his face, as she was acting differently than before. She smiled and said that he should understand that laughing alone won't work. He looked at her in surprise and asked what he should do in that case. Dalen smiled and said that usually people laugh together. Dalen, looking at the young man, said that he also needed to learn to laugh in order to move in society. He looked at her with bewilderment, thinking about her words. But a moment later, he sighed heavily and leaned closer to her. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was really that difficult for him. Dalen sighed heavily and asked if he had never laughed. She was puzzled because she didn't know how she could teach him something like that. Dalen smiled and said that he could definitely do it, just like ordinary people could, and that meant he could do everything too. She shouted that he would quickly learn everything. Dalen looked at the young man with a smile and asked him to raise his hands up and repeat after her. He sighed heavily, but still did as she asked. At the same time, the young lady slowly carried the box of groceries into the kitchen. Dalen understood that facial muscles were just muscles, and he would learn to smile in time. But every time such incidents occurred, she thought about his past life. She was puzzled, because she didn't know whether this person would be able to fit in with the people who had lived that very ordinary life. Dalen knew that she had to take him into high society at any cost. She understood that what happened to him next was none of her business. Dalen sighed heavily as she realized she needed to focus on what was in front of her eyes. A moment later, she walked into the young man's room with a cheerful smile and greeted him. She looked at him with a gentle smile and said that today they would practice smiling, since they had discussed this situation yesterday. But a moment later, she was taken aback as the young man suddenly grabbed her and pulled her towards him. He looked intently into the distance and told her that they had arrived. She was in shock and did not understand what was going on and who had arrived. But a moment later, he pushed off the ground and they were flying down. Dalen was in shock and screaming at the young man to stop immediately. She was puzzled because she saw that a lord had come to visit them at the estate. The young man was taken aback when he saw them flying towards him. He looked at them intently and said that they had suddenly jumped down, and that was why he was very scared. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he had fainted so suddenly. He looked away from them with embarrassment and said that if he didn't do exactly that, they wouldn't pay attention to him. She was shocked and didn't understand who he was portraying now. He smiled and said that she was in demand for such scenes, and he also asked what they were doing in general. Dalen sighed heavily and looked at the Lord with confusion, since everything that happened was his fault. She turned her gaze to her ward and asked him to calm down. Dalen was very scared when the young man suddenly grabbed her, but she knew that such jumps had happened more than once. Dalen looked closely at our new friend and asked him to calm down, and also asked if he remembered what he needed to do in order to calm down faster. At the same time, the Lord looked at them with bewilderment as he was amazed. But a moment later, he shouted with a satisfied smile that it was just excellent. She sighed heavily and asked what was wrong with that. Dalen looked closely at the young man and said that next time he should somehow make his presence known, because a little more and the matter could end in bloodshed. The young man was shocked by her words. He shouted that he made his presence known, and the young master should have noticed him as soon as he entered. Dalen looked at her friend in surprise and asked what had happened to him, as he had suddenly become quiet for no apparent reason. Lauren looked at them with a smile and said that the main thing was that he calmed down, but for some reason this irritated him a little. He smiled and said that the Holy Father had already gotten used to it. She looked at him in surprise, but was glad, as she was pleased to hear confirmation of her suspicions from others. She looked at him intently and asked if he really thought that. He smiled and said that, of course, it was obvious how hard she had worked all this time. She was shocked and screamed that she really put all her soul and all her strength into it. He smiled and said that he understood her. Dalen screamed that she had poured invaluable and unique, sincere efforts into this work. The Lord looked at her intently and said that, of course, he promised a reward for her such services. She smiled and said that she was only following the teaching. Dalen looked at the young man with bewilderment and asked what brought him to them so early in the morning. He looked at her with a smile and said that he had only come to them to give her a book. He brought her the basics of etiquette for receiving the imperial family, which they had to learn in just one day. Dalen was a little puzzled when she saw this book. Dalen looked at the young man intently and said that it was just a terrible title, and she had a bad feeling about it after she saw the book. He looked at her with a smile and asked what kind of bad feeling she was talking about. He said that these were simply wonderful events. Lauren looked at the young lady with a joyful smile and said that finally, tomorrow, the prince and Madame Charlotte would come to them. The young lady froze in shock when she heard such information. She was shocked by everything she heard and screamed that this was simply not real. She hoped that he was just lying to her. But in turn, the young man looked at her with a satisfied smile and said that if they tried really hard, they would succeed. She was shocked because she understood that even if he said such words, it was the decision of the imperial family, and they could not refuse. Dalen fell to the ground in exhaustion. She understood that this was simply truly impossible. He smiled and said that she shouldn't try so hard, because everything would be fine. But in turn, the young man looked at them intently, but said nothing to them. Dalen was puzzled, because they barely returned from the battlefield alive. She understood that they could have been executed just because they did not please the imperial family. She sighed heavily, because she knew that even dead they would regret it. The young man sighed heavily and said that life is always at stake. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she could not believe what he said. Dalen, looking at her friend, realized that a person's instinct is to protect their life and what is dear to them. She was shocked and did not understand what kind of training one needs to undergo in order to say such things. She did not understand how she could raise him. Dalen looked at the young man intently and asked how many lives he had. He always looked at her with a knowing look, but she said that he only had one life. He looked at her in surprise and said that everyone had one life. Dalen, in all seriousness, said that for this reason everyone valued their life, leading to only one. Dalen sighed heavily, as it seemed to her that he did not quite understand her, but looking at him, she asked him to take care of his life so as not to lose it. Dalen assumed that if she simply told him that, he would remember her words at the right moment, but she assumed that no one had ever said such simple things to him, so he didn't understand them. She saw his silent gaze, which did not express any emotions. Dalen looked at the young man with a smile and said that he was a good boy, because he tried very hard. Because earlier she said that if he did not understand anything, he should just nod his head. She turned around and sighed heavily, knowing they would have to skip the smile practice if she wanted him to greet the guests looking like a tough guy. Dalen sighed heavily and told her companion that there was one important mission that needed to be completed before the meeting. He looked at her in confusion, not understanding what she was talking about. She turned around and said that an important mission awaited them. Sometime later, she said with a satisfied smile that they were in for a general cleaning. She was even a little ashamed to force him to act like a tough guy like that. But if they saw the whole pigsty, they might cut their budget. Dalen looked at the young man with a smile and said that she would clean the corridor from the first floor to the women's wing, and he should take care of the stairs and corridor on the second floor. She smiled and said that they would hardly be able to clean all the rooms, so they needed to clean the corridors that would definitely catch the eye. He looked at her intently and said that he understood everything. Dalen understood perfectly well that cleaning was not her job at all, because according to the young lord, she only had to look after the young man, and other people were supposed to do everything else. But as soon as she arrived at the estate, she immediately realized that due to certain circumstances, the cleaning was left to her. Neither she nor the young man paid much attention to such things, so they were not uncomfortable without someone looking after the house. But she had not expected that they would have to clean up so suddenly. Dalen sighed heavily, as they were used to seeing only polished hallways, so she needed to thoroughly clean the floor at the entrance. Daylin sighed heavily. Knowing she needed to focus on cleaning, she was worried because she knew the situation was far from peaceful, because the imperial family would arrive tomorrow, and they had to clean the entire huge mansion in one day. She wondered if she had become stronger, because she was curious about it. She thought that she had become stronger after returning from the battlefield. She understood that she simply had incredible fortitude, but a moment later, she threw all her thoughts away more easily, because she knew that this was not true. Daylin knew it was because her new friend had become so reliable, and she had learned to cook. But a moment later, the young lady was taken aback and froze for a moment. She wondered if he even knew how to clean. She was shocked because she realized that she had made a huge mistake. She ran in a hurry to meet the young man because she was shocked by her logic, because she left him alone and did not even check if he knew how to clean. She was in shock and did not understand how much time had passed, and she hoped that he did not tear the wallpaper to shreds, like in his room. Daylin wondered again if he had stained the paintings while trying to clean them. She was shocked and didn't understand what they would do if a dark pink color appeared on the painting. In a hurry, the young lady ran into the corridor, which was being cleaned by a young man. She froze in shock as she was blinded by the bright light. She looked at her with bewilderment, but he looked at her with even more bewilderment, but continued cleaning. She was shocked because he cleaned very well. Daylin looked at the young man intently and asked him to stop. He looked at her with bewilderment. Daylin sighed heavily and stopped him, saying that they only needed to clean the visible areas. She looked at him intently and said that he had to remember the main thing about cleaning, to create the appearance that he had tried. She said that he should get maximum visual effect with minimum effort. He froze in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. But she understood perfectly well that they had to achieve maximum results with minimum effort. Kels looked at her with wide eyes and said that the basis of battle is cleaning, and cleaning is battle. The young lady looked at him with puzzlement and said that now they are fighting a battle with dust. Daylin said that just like in a fight, he should target the enemy leader first. So here, they should attack the visible dust first, and then the little things. She froze for a moment in surprise as she saw his eyes glowing, ready to start a battle. He looked into the distance with fury and said that they needed to sweep away everything in their path. The next day, they greeted guests from the imperial palace. But, unfortunately, not everyone was in great shape. The young lady knew perfectly well that everyone would be interested in why she was dressed like that, but she knew that it was a very interesting story. They thought the cleaning would never end, but thanks to the young man's excellent physical abilities, they were able to finish early. Daylin knew the young man would be more successful as a janitor than as a nobleman, but a moment later, she was taken aback, for she knew that now was not the time to admire such things. Daylin looked at the young man with a smile and said that they had overcome one big mountain, and now they should move on to the next step. He looked at her intently as he was ready for the next task. Daylin said with a smile that the next task was to learn manners to avoid execution. She knew that entering the university was not mandatory, but they had to survive at any cost, so they were required to learn a lesson in etiquette. Daylin was glad to have received the latest version of the etiquette manual from the Lord, but she decided that the content of etiquette had hardly changed much in recent years, since she knew all the rules of communication with members of the imperial family by heart. Ordinary priests were also carefully trained in etiquette, in case of visits or summonses from nobles. Daylin trained so hard to get the bonus for placing first on the exam that her lower back even started to hurt. Daylin smiled and told the young man that they should start with a greeting, but now she wanted to show him an example and asked him to repeat after her. He looked at her closely and said that he understood everything. She smiled and said that he should pull in his stomach, keep his back straight, but at the same time he should straighten his shoulders and relax a little, and also he should maintain a straight angle. She asked him to gracefully describe an arc with his shoulders and greet the person. A moment later, the young man followed all her instructions. Daylin was shocked as she was unexpectedly blinded by his light. Daylin knew that the radiance of beauty that only a temple servant could possess was now on the young man. She was shocked. She couldn't believe that he, a newbie, had again reached a level that she couldn't reach. Kels looked at the young lady with bewilderment, but said nothing. A moment later, he finished her off with words. Because he said it was a simple movement. She froze in shock, as she knew that not everyone could do this movement the first time. Overall, thanks to his perfect handling of the cleaning and etiquette, the preparations went off without a hitch. But, unfortunately, things didn't go according to her plan. She saw his explosive temper and shouted for him to calm down, as the members of the imperial family were already approaching, so they had to greet them. She was in shock, did not understand where he was going. Kels looked at the young lady intently, but said nothing. She sighed heavily and said that she felt the presence of only small animals in the mansion. She knew that his sensitivity remained the same. Although they rehearsed at the entrance to the mansion, as soon as he stepped outside, he began to react sharply to countless stimuli. She was puzzled as he reacted even to the leaves of the wind. She understood that at this stage he could kill all the animals. She hoped that no one would ever approach him from this moment onwards. Yesterday, with tears in her eyes, she begged him to calm down and not kill anyone. She understood that if he had listened when she cried and begged, then he could have already made his debut in society. Dalen tried everything to somehow tame his wild temper, but she understood that this could not be achieved in one day. She understood that you cannot just take and turn a mad dog into a noble gentleman with the snap of a finger. She, beaten and broken, thought that she had done it after all. Dalen knew that since things hadn't worked out right away, she wanted to show that she had tried. She wanted to show how much she had suffered. She wanted to show how much she had sacrificed herself and worked hard. Dalen knew she had to let go of all her noble pretensions, because she knew that once she showed how much she had suffered, she could get what she wanted. She knew the mansion was very clean and she was dirty, so she wanted to play on the contrast. She knew that the prince was very young, and Charlotte had come to them for some political purpose, and if she recognized them as useful pawns, she would certainly offer some support and try to take advantage of them. Dalen sighed and told the young man that he should wait where he was, and she also asked him to greet them when they got out of the carriage and do everything as they had trained up to this point. He sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. Dalen ensured a distance he could maintain. She knew that greetings were not required to be made at close range. She understood that if Charlotte and the prince valued their lives, they should understand this. She looked closely at her future gold mine, and for a moment she froze in shock, but she was also blinded by the beauty of the young lady. Dalen Seung fell to the ground with a thud as she saw a smile that could make you feel the fullness of the sunlight. Dalen bowed low and greeted the prince and Lady Charlotte, while her companion also greeted them from a distance. Dalen smiled and introduced herself, and didn't forget to introduce her companion. They looked at her in bewilderment as they saw all her scars. Dalen looked at Charlotte with a satisfied smile, as she knew that this was now her trump card. She looked away from the young lady and said that for those who serve God, the path sometimes turns into a thorny road. She said that they were servants of God and should not be stopped by fear. Charlotte was shocked, because she thought that the priests were just modulating and giving blessings. But seeing how she suffered, following the will of God, she had little heart. Charlotte looked closely at her son and asked if he thought the same. He smiled and agreed with her. A moment later, the prince looked at the young lady and thanked her for her hard work. Dalen looked at the prince in surprise, as she assumed that he was just a child, but he turned out to be very serious. She saw that he was very similar to his mother, as he was very cute. Dalen looked closely at Charlotte, as she looked very young, and it seemed to her that they looked more like brother and sister than mother and son. She noticed that he looked very much like his mother. Dalen knew that at first glance he had platinum hair and green eyes like his mother, but from a different angle, when the light fell on them, his eyes and hair sparkled with different colors. She saw gemstone eyes. It was a sign of imperial blood. Looking at the young lady, the parents asked why the young man was standing so far away from them. Dalen was taken aback for a moment, but after a few seconds, she smiled and said that he had very sharp hearing, and if he got too close to him, his ears could be damaged. The young prince was shocked by this information. He sighed heavily and said that they couldn't do anything about it then, but he was still upset because he wanted to greet him closer. Dalen smiled and said that he had just returned from the battlefield and he still needed rest. but someday he would be able to greet him close by. Daylin was puzzled because she knew that his ears would be damaged, and their bodies could be torn to shreds, but unfortunately, she couldn't say that. She was glad that Kels wasn't a capricious child at all. She looked at the prince closely and asked if he would like to see where Lord Kels lived. He smiled and agreed, and also politely asked her to show them around. The young lady, in turn, was very glad that everything was going smoothly. She thought that if they followed the route she had discussed with her charge in advance, everything would be fine. But unfortunately, at that very moment, everything went wrong as they were attacked, and the arrow flew past the young lady. But at the same time, it touched her fragile and without that skin. The arrow hit the carriage with a roar and almost hit the young prince. Daylin was acutely aware that things didn't always go the way they wanted. She turned around in rage, looking at everyone present as someone reported that they were being attacked by assassins. Someone's cry, unfortunately, started the chaos. At that very moment, the knights rushed to protect Lady Charlotte and the prince. The lord was in shock. He shouted at the knights to calm down and not run around with their screams. He shouted at the priestess to blow the whistle. But at that moment, without thinking, she ran after her new ward. The lord was in shock and shouted after her. She ran as fast as she could towards the young man, as she clearly understood that she had to stop him. They ran deep into the forest, and she called him, but he did not stop. Daylin was furious because she knew she had been too naive. She hadn't expected the assassin hunting her charge to be so careful. She thought Charlotte and the prince had nothing to worry about because they had knights and bodyguards. Daylin was furious because she saw that the young man had run away, and she had let him go. The knight shouted at the priestess to run away, and they would take care of the rest. She turned around and shouted angrily that it was her cue. She didn't understand why they were still here. She shouted and asked if they hadn't received orders from the lord. The young man was taken aback and looked at the young lady with bewilderment. He said that everything was exactly like that. She shouted that when the squad members went into combat mode, the allies should keep a safe distance, and if there were any wards, they should evacuate them, providing them with safety. Daylin knew that if they had just caught the killer, there would be no need to be so desperate to identify him. But the problem was, what would happen after they dealt with the killer? She knew that the smell of blood in battle, the sensation of torn flesh, screams, violence easily excited people, and if a member of the squad, possessing well-developed senses and attracted by blood, broke down, then it would be very bad for everyone. She knew that he would probably go crazy and start acting up. She knew that he would be furious and not distinguish between friends and enemies. Daylin understood that if even one of the imperial bodyguards, or even someone from the imperial family, was killed, it would be irreparable. She looked at the young man closely and said that she would deal with it, so he should return and wait quietly. They were all taken aback when they heard a loud scream. Daylin froze for a moment as she walked deeper into the forest, hearing cries for help and seeing bodies. All those present were shot on the spot for a moment and prepared for an attack. The young lady, in turn, slowly took out her weapon. At the same time, the lord ran up to them and shouted to Daylin not to come closer and to quickly pull out the whistle. Daylin. She was furious and knew she had to fix everything no matter what. At that very moment, she rushed to meet her charge, but she was taken aback when she saw his enraged look. He ran towards her screaming without realizing it. Daylin was furious and knew she didn't care what happened next. The lord was in shock. He shouted to the priestess, but it was all in vain as he saw that she rushed towards the young man. At that very moment, they ran towards each other. Daylin called the young man, but he didn't answer her. A moment later, she threw herself into his arms. She hugged him tightly and hung on his powerful body, but he was still burning with rage. He ran past everyone. They were in shock because they didn't know what to do. The lord, meanwhile, shouted and begged the young lady to get the whistle so that she could use it quickly. He was shocked and shouted that if she didn't do something like this, everyone would die. Daylin, in turn, understood perfectly well everything that was happening, but she could not do something like that to him. Looking at the young man, she asked him to take a deep breath and stop. She wanted him to try to breathe slowly while she closed him off from everything he saw. At that very moment, she used her divine power and asked him to calm down, Otherwise, everyone might die. She was in shock because he did not serve her and continued to run. She was very scared. She screamed that he should listen to her. Dalen punched the young man with his small fists, but he kept running. He knew they would finish before he killed everyone in his path. But a moment later, insight came to him, and he wondered who he should kill. But after a few seconds, his inner voice told him that it made no difference who he had to kill, because everyone had to be destroyed. He understood that there were only enemies and only one danger on his path. He knew that now he felt anger, pain, the smell of blood tearing from within, a scream. But then he felt someone's presence and heard someone's familiar voice. Dalen screamed at him that he had to calm down because he had decided to live like a human being. Moments later, the young man finally stopped. She breathed a sigh of relief as she realized that she had succeeded. But at the same time, the knights looked at the young people with fear. Kells was furious as he felt enemies nearby, pointing their swords at him. He was taken aback when he heard the desperate voice. She looked at him intently and asked if he had calmed down. Kells sighed and said that he could feel the sound of a heart. She looked at him with a happy smile and said that it was. Dalen asked joyfully if it was too loud. She shouted that he should wait and she would immediately move away from him. But at that moment, the young lady was taken aback as he hugged her tighter. He whispered quietly that she should not leave, because he wanted to hear the sounds of her heart. Dalian was puzzled, because she understood that an incident had occurred, and a serious one at that, right in front of the representatives of the imperial family. She understood that she needed to somehow explain the situation. So she thought. But a moment later, a real miracle happened. Charlotte looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she had done much harder work than she could have imagined. Dalen sighed heavily and said that she was only following God's will, and at the same time she apologized if she had frightened them. Charlotte looked at them with a gentle smile and said that nothing terrible had happened, since an attempt on her life was a common occurrence. She smiled brightly and said that she was deeply touched by God's broad heart, full of mercy and love, and also by the beautiful courage of the young lady who followed God's will. She smiled and said that this impressed her the most. The young lady was shocked because Charlotte was smiling too brightly, but she bowed low and said that it was just her mission. To give the impression of a holy priestess who sacrificed herself is her true mission. Charlotte looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she, of course, could not interfere with the sacred work of God, but she wanted to do her best to help her, somehow as a human, one way or another. She, in fulfilling her mission, enlisted the support of a high-ranking lady. Dalen was furious because she didn't even want this to happen. She was very tired and wanted to go to rest as soon as possible. Dalen was grateful for the help, but now she was exhausted, so she had no time for it. She, unfortunately, did not have the strength to curry favor even with Lady Charlotte. True trust, that's what she wanted to get. Dalen looked at the prince with a smile and asked if he was injured. The prince said with a happy smile that he was fine, but her actions and the young master's were simply magnificent. Dalen looked at the prince with bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. The prince looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile, said that it was even stronger than they said about her, and he looked forward to meeting them at the banquet. She was taken aback and said with a smile that she would do everything possible to make this meeting happen. Dalen smiled at the prince, but in her head, she thought that he was still a very strange child. She wondered if his eyesight was bad. She couldn't imagine how cool he looked now. Charlotte told her son with a smile that the young lady would have a lot of trouble in the future, since making her debut in high society was not an easy matter. Charlotte smiled and told the young lady that she'd actually heard about the case before. Only negative reviews, but current events in the village had given her hope. Charlotte smiled and asked if the day would come when she would be able to talk to Kels on her own. Dalen looked at Lady Charlotte, but after a few seconds said that of course she could do something like that. Charlotte looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and extended her hand to her. Dalen looked at her with bewilderment. Charlotte smiled and said that she was looking forward to this moment. Dalen, in turn, froze for a moment in bewilderment, but after a few seconds, she asked for forgiveness, because her hands were now very dirty. She quickly wiped her hand. Charlotte smiled and said that it was a great honor for her to touch the noble hand. Dalen looked at the lady intently, as she knew that she was a brave girl, although she had no experience in war, as she did not hesitate to extend her hand, which was stained with blood and pieces of flesh. Dayline froze in shock as she felt a holy power coming from the young lady. Charlotte smiled and said that she was glad to have such a meeting, and she also said that she was glad that such a strange and capable priest took on such a job. Dalen was taken aback for a moment and froze in place. Charlotte smiled and said that she hoped for their further cooperation. Charlotte looked closely at her son and said that it was time for them to go back. The prince smiled and said goodbye to the young people as he left. Dalen froze and stared after them, with a look of bewilderment on her face. She knew very well that the holy power, the immeasurable, inexplicable, strange ability, was possessed by only a few, and even fewer had such strong abilities that others noticed it. Dalen knew very well that some people even died, without realizing that they had sacred power. Dalen knew full well that this was simply impossible, and that with that level of power, a person should have realized it themselves, because when she gained her power at an early age, she immediately realized it. She was surprised, because she saw in front of her an empress who possessed holy power. Looking at Charlotte, she wondered if this was a good thing. Charlotte turned around and said goodbye to the young people. Dalen sighed heavily as she decided to let this situation go, because even if she knew about it, she couldn't do anything about it, because she knew that this was a matter of high circles. Dalen bowed and asked the young men to take care of themselves on the road. Dalen was puzzled, because she couldn't get the idea out of her head that the Empress possessed holy powers. Dalen knew they were showing a strong interest in the squad members, so she got the feeling that someone was following the trails laid out in a script someone had written. She wondered if God had written that script. A moment later, she looked at us in his ward. Dalen was a little puzzled, because she saw that the young man was too quiet. She was worried, so she told him to stand not in the room, but where she could see him clearly. Dalen was taken aback and wondered with fear if he had passed out while standing. She knew she had poured a lot of holy power into him, and it wouldn't be surprising if he lost consciousness now. They stood in silence for a while, looking into the distance. Dalen knew it had been too long a day, so she returned to the mansion as quickly as possible. She slowly took the young man by the hand and led him upstairs. A few minutes later, they entered my room, and she sat him down on a chair. Dalen looked closely at the young man and asked him to rest a little. Dalen walked slowly out of the room and sighed heavily. The young man looked at her intently and asked if she had anything to tell him. She looked at the Lord in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her coldly and asked why she did not use the whistle. He was furious and said that it could have escalated into a very serious incident. Dalen sighed heavily and said that since a serious incident had not happened, it didn't make any difference now. He was furious and said that Lady Charlotte and the prince and everyone else could turn into a pile of flesh. She sighed heavily and said that it was all because they were people. He looked at her with bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was talking about. Dalen looked menacingly at the Lord and asked if it was not natural to mark herself as a human to him so that he would become one. Dalen looked at the young man closely and said that she was confident. He sighed heavily and said that, from her appearance, it was not obvious that she was like that. She sighed heavily and said that in the end, she was convinced that she could stop him. Lore sighed heavily and said that since the responsible person, whom he saw every day, said so, then he could not do anything about it, because in the end, everything ended well. He sighed heavily and said that he collected the dismembered bodies, returned home, wrote a report, met with the chief, and conducted an investigation. He was puzzled because he knew that this was very hard work. The Lord smiled and said that in that case, he would come to them again, and she should also call him any time she needed anything. Dalen bowed and thanked the young man for his work. Lauren was puzzled and did not know if he could see a human being in him, although he himself asked to be treated as a human being. Lauren was puzzled because he understood that he had to make a noble gentleman out of him, or make a mad dog out of him that pretended to be a noble gentleman. He knew that this was the goal of that man. With the last of her strength, the young lady entered the room and sighed heavily. She was furious and simply disgusted to hear the young man. She looked closely at Kalis and asked if he was okay. Kayla's looking at the young lady. The lady said that his condition was normal. She looked at him closely and realized that he was far from normal. She sighed heavily and said that this was not a battlefield at all. He looked at her in bewilderment. A moment later, the young lady said in all seriousness that they had a new assignment. Kels looked at her with a wary, intent look. She smiled and said that they should take a bath. Dalen said with a satisfied smile that the young man should wash himself properly. She smiled and said that he should first undress and then wash himself. As she left, she smiled and said that he should tidy himself up as well as she did, so that they could meet afterward. With a contented smile, the young lady left him, and the young man in turn looked after her intently, but said nothing. A moment later, he had undressed and leisurely climbed into the bathroom. He reached for the small bar of soap, but immediately pulled back. Kels froze in place for a moment, and since he saw that the small bar of soap was fragile and slippery, the smell from it was very cloying. Kels realized that it was so fragile that it seemed like it would crumble with the slightest force, like a flower that could easily be crushed by stepping on it. He wondered if rest and cleanliness were really such a necessity for the young lady. He remembered her smilingly asking him whether he liked her or not. He was furious because he hated all sounds and wanted them to stop. He knew there were no sounds he wanted to hear. Kels considered the pleasant sound for a moment. He remembered hugging the young beautiful lady and asking her to stay with him because he wanted to hear the beautiful sound of her heart. With lightning speed, he brought his body into order, and after a few minutes, he said to himself that he would like to hear more of the sound that was pleasant to him. At the same time, the young lady was taking a bath with a contented smile and humming a cheerful melody to herself. Taking a bath, she came to life. She wondered when was the last time she could calmly take a bath alone. She knew that without such a social package, she could not handle this job. She thought for a moment, as she became curious. So she wondered if the priests helped the other members of the squad. She wondered how many more such luxurious mansions there were. She understood that the young man was one of the best. She threw away all thoughts about others with a smile, since she knew that it was simply in vain to worry, because the others had probably dealt with something similar. She knew that the future was very foggy, and she shouldn't think about such things. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she heard a crash. At that very moment, she froze in shock as she saw a young man who appeared before her, naked as his mother gave birth to him. She froze in bewilderment and looked intently at the young man. At the same time, he looked at her intently, without uttering a single word. She was taken aback and looked at herself, and at that very moment, she screamed very loudly. She was in shock. So out of fear, she quickly threw a small bucket at him, and at the same time, she shouted at him to close his eyes and not look at her. She was able to close herself off, but she knew it would have been better if this had not happened to her. Dalen was in shock, because she didn't understand how something like this could happen. She screamed very loudly, and the young man almost went deaf. She froze in place in shock, as she realized that she had not only screamed, but also attacked him. She was very scared, as she did not know what to do now. Dalen looked at the young man closely, as she did not understand what he was even planning. She sighed heavily and asked if he was okay, while she said that before opening the door, you need to knock. And in general, you can't just barge into the bathroom. Dalen was in shock. She didn't understand what he needed because he suddenly burst into her. Dalen sat back down in the bathroom with lightning speed, and the young man approached her and said that she was very far away. He looked deep into her eyes and said that the sound of her heart was very far away, but he wanted her heart to be closer to him. Dalen froze in shock. Dalen looked at the young man, spellbound, as he said, "Okay," for the first time, without being asked. She was very happy that he was growing up, and she knew that if he were a real dog, she would have given him a treat. But she knew he was human, so she asked him not to look at her. He looked at her in bewilderment, but at that very moment he closed his eyes. Dalen sighed heavily, and looking at her companion, said that she understood everything, and now he had to leave quickly. Kels was very hurt, but he walked out the door meekly. She shouted that he should quickly close the door. He sighed heavily, but still obeyed. She sat silently for a while, looking at the door. She sighed heavily, because she knew that they didn't even let her wash herself in peace. Dalen knew there was nothing she could do about it, since her role was to rush over if the mad gentleman needed to calm down. She was puzzled, but still, sometime later, she met a young man and looked at him with puzzlement. She knew that she had to calm down and look only forward, without lowering her gaze. Daylin was in shock because she knew that this was a complete disaster, as she had never seen anything like it. But she had to admit that she had seen a good male body on the battlefield, and shame was no longer a problem for her. But considering the fact that he had just gotten out of the bath, his body was simply top-notch. She understood that if he became a noble lord, then all the girls would be hanging around his neck. But a moment later, she noticed something and looked at him in bewilderment. Daylin looked at her companion and asked if he had washed himself well. Kells looked at her with bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was talking about. She sighed heavily and said that there were still places that he had not washed. Looking around, she realized that they were all over his body. She said that there was still dirt under his nails and asked if he really had used soap. She looked intently at the young man, as she expected an answer. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he always washed like that. Kel sighed heavily and said that it was so. She was shocked. She didn't understand what the scum of the squad were doing, because they couldn't even teach him how to wash properly. In principle, she guessed why everything turned out this way, because this detachment was considered to be death row, so it would never have occurred to anyone to teach a pawn to wash. She was in shock and didn't understand why she had to clean up everything. A moment later, she gave him a towel and asked him not to take it off. Daylin sighed heavily as the image of his beautiful and sparkling details kept coming back to her mind. She prayed to God to erase those memories from her head. Kells looked closely at his trail and told her that her heart was pounding wildly now. Her gait was unsteady. He asked if she was hurt or sick. She was taken aback and said that she was not, and he should not pay attention to it. Some time later, the young lady entered the bathroom and noticed a mess. Daylin sighed heavily as she saw that there was almost no water and the towels were all dry. She didn't understand how he managed to wash himself at all. Daylin turned on the water and told the young man that hot water was coming out of the left faucet and cold water was coming out of the right one. She asked him to regulate the pressure from both faucets to fill the bathtub with water of a pleasant temperature. A moment later, she asked him to slowly get into the bath, and also said that if he was hot, he should add cold water, and if cold, then hot. After a few seconds, he slowly immersed himself in the water. Daylin looked at the young man intently. She saw the stern but controlled expression on his face, and sighing heavily, she said that if he felt too hot or cold, he should say so. Kel said with suppressed fury that he didn't like baths. She touched the water with confusion and said that she thought the temperature was just right, but she still asked what specifically he didn't like. He sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that when taking a bath, all sensations were dulled. Kels was puzzled, knowing that he wouldn't be able to react to the attack and that at this rate his reaction time would be slowed down. She looked closely at the young man, because she realized that it was not that he did not love, but that it was all a matter of habit. She smiled and said that he could relax more, but he refused. She smiled and said that he could try it at least once and then say whether he liked it or not. She knew that on the battlefield, where he had to be constantly on guard, he probably never experienced such sensations. She knew that when he got used to the bath, he would be able to feel differently. Daylin approached the young man with a smile and told him that he should sit still, and first she would teach him how to wash his hair. My head, she asked him to close his eyes, as the foam could get into his eyes. A moment later, he humbly did as she asked, but when the young lady began to wash his back, he winced. She smiled and said that if he was not afraid of the foam in their eyes, he could open his eyes. Kels opened his eyes, but in turn he was shaking and straining with all his might. Daylin smiled and said that if it hurt, he shouldn't endure it, because she wanted to wash off all the foam right now. A moment later, the young lady froze and saw the young man in a completely new form. Daylin looked at the young man with a smile, as she adored such an appearance. She knew that he had no flaws at all, but she assumed that on the battlefield, such an appearance was unnecessary. Daylin looked at the young man with a smile and said that he now looked better than before, while she asked him to raise his head a little and also to relax and straighten his shoulders. Sometime later, the young man followed all her instructions and enjoyed himself. Dalen looked at her charge with a satisfied smile and asked him to continue enjoying himself in the same spirit, and also asked him to give her his hand. Dalen asked him not to forget to clean the dirt under his nails properly, because he was a future aristocrat. She said that in the future, he would be looked after and the maids would do everything, but she knew that he would not like it. She smiled and said that in that case, he should try himself. If she teaches him, and he will succeed. She also asked him to wash everything else with soap, and when he finishes, he should dry himself with a towel and come to her. She looked closely at the young man, because she understood that little by little he would cope with everything. Dalen sighed heavily, because she knew that at first there was only despair, but now she was happy about little things. She smiled and said that she would go and get some fruit. A moment later, she turned around and looked at her charge with confusion and informed him that there was a robe hanging by the door, and he was absolutely required to put it on before going out. He looked at her in surprise but still agreed. Kels watched the young lady closely, but a moment later he lay down quietly in the bathtub and relaxed. About an hour later, the young lady looked at him closely and said that he had done a good job of washing himself well and putting on his robe. She was shocked, asking if they really needed this room. After his bath, they had a small problem. The young lady was puzzled because she saw what the room looked like. She asked if he really thought he could sleep well in it. Dalen knew that the young man loved white rooms without any irritants. She was shocked. She did not understand what the princess's pink mansion had to do with it. She wondered if he had gone too far in his search for simplicity. She looked closely at the young man and asked if he was sure. He sighed heavily and said that he probably was. Dalen looked at him puzzled, knowing he wasn't exactly sure himself, but she didn't want to bring the subject up any further. Dalen sighed heavily and said that since it was necessary, she agreed with him. Dalen looked closely at the young man and said that he should understand that her room was next door, so he should not make noise, regardless of his facial expression. He said that everything would be fine. She sighed heavily as she remembered how he had come to her last time, but she realized that if he spoke, she had to take him at his word. Dalen threw all her assumptions away, as she understood that nothing was normal. Kels sighed heavily and said that the words did not really match up with her actions. Dalen understood that other rooms were tactically much more convenient, and there were many of them in the mansion. She realized that before they fell asleep, they could look at other rooms. Dalen looked around and realized that the rooms were so clean and luxurious that it was almost eye-popping. She understood that this was in any case better than the torture chambers and prison cells, but he wanted to be in them. Dalen sighed heavily and said that they couldn't go through all the rooms in one day, and they could look again tomorrow. He sighed heavily and said that instead of running around again, like they had before, he would rather spend the night on the roof. A moment later, ignoring the young lady, he walked up to the bed and said that it was time to sleep. Dalen was taken aback and looked at the young man in surprise, as she knew that his words were true. She looked at him in bewilderment and wished him good night. Some time later, the young man lay quietly in bed. Kels lay quietly, while the young lady behind the next wall slept soundly. He was a little puzzled because she was very noisy, because at that time he could hear her breathing and heartbeat. He knew that even though it was noisy, he had to fall asleep, and despite everything, he closed his eyes and fell into a deep sleep. The next day, the young lady was overjoyed and praised him wholeheartedly. She was very glad that today he himself managed to wash himself clean. Dalen was taken aback, but still looked at him with a smile, since, unfortunately, she did not teach him how to dry his body properly. She smiled and said that yesterday he was pouring out the power of holy force, the whole review, so today she wanted to teach him how to use a towel properly. Dalen looked at him with a joyful smile, as he exuded the scent of a noble gentleman. She said that with a little more effort, he could go to the ball. Dalen looked closely at the young man and smiled, and told him that he should sit down as she wanted to teach him how to dry his hair properly. He reached up to his face in surprise as he felt the first signs of a smile, and at the same time, he said that she didn't have to do that. Dalen looked at him in bewilderment as she didn't understand what he was talking about. Dalen smiled and asked if he didn't feel better. He looked at her in surprise but didn't answer. Dayline smiled and said that after the bath, he probably had a stomach ache, and so they should dry off quickly and go eat. She asked him with a smile to close his eyes, because that way the hair would not get into his eyes. Daylin sighed heavily as she remembered that he didn't like to sit with his eyes closed. She smiled and said that if he didn't want to, he didn't have to close his eyes, as she would be careful. But still, the young man sighed heavily and closed his eyes. He was puzzled, because he knew that one could only close one's eyes when someone had died. On the battlefield, it was clear anyway, since he had to keep an eye on his surroundings without looking away. He knew that the soldiers of his unit had to serve the bones on the battlefield, and they had to carry out all orders. It was so scary to sleep that they endured it until the very end, just so they wouldn't have to close their eyes. He didn't want to die from something like this at all. He knew it was simply impossible. He threw all his thoughts away when he heard the young lady's voice again. She was happily praising him. Daylin smiled as she looked at the young man and said that when he washed or dried himself, it was not necessary to forcefully close his eyes. She smiled and said that when he got used to it, with his eyes open, the water would not get in. She smiled and said that over time he would get used to everything. Daylin sighed heavily and said that when he became a noble, the maid would do everything, but since he didn't want to deal with maids, he had to handle such things on his own. Kells was puzzled because he knew that closing his eyes was very scary, and the longer it was, the scarier it became. She smiled and told him that he didn't need to worry because he was a fast learner. Kells, in turn, listened to the young lady's voice as if he were armed. He realized that it was pleasant for him to close his eyes and listen to her, so he wanted to sit in this position for a little longer. A moment later, the young lady became distracted and asked him to wait a bit. She quickly moved away from him and began a small search, but at the same time, he felt threatened and became angry. Daylin turned around and looked at the young man with a satisfied smile and told him that he should look in the mirror she had just found. Daylin smiled and said that he probably hadn't really seen his own face in the war. She said that, in order to look fashionable, he needed to know what he looked like. Daylin smiled and said that with his looks, anything would suit him. She smiled and said that he was very handsome and he should confirm it. He turned away with a heavy sigh and said that he didn't know. Daylin looked at the young man with a joyful smile and asked him to take a good look at his reflection. She said that maybe he wouldn't understand it now, but as soon as he went out into the world, he would understand how handsome he was. Daylin looked at the young man with a tender smile and said that his parents must have been handsome. Daylin froze for a moment, her expression darkening as she knew the members of the squad had been trained for war since childhood. She wondered if his parents had sent him to war. She was curious to know about the other members of the squad, so she wondered if they, like him, had been cruelly sent to the squad. She knew that if he were cleaned up and dressed up, he would be a very ordinary person. At the same time, Lord froze in shock when he saw a truly terrible picture. He was in shock and didn't understand what they should do with the young man now. But he, in turn, growled menacingly, and in response, they did not pay attention to anything. Sometime later, the young lady looked at her charge with admiration as he was shining with beauty. She was shocked because he was emitting a very bright light. She knew that with such an appearance, it was unlikely that anyone would pay attention to the little things, so with her radiant smile, she asked him to walk a little. Kells looked at Daylin in surprise and asked if something had happened and she had gotten hurt. She smiled, blinded by the glow coming from her, and told him that she was okay. Daylin said with a smile that he was simply dazzlingly handsome. Kells looked at her with confusion, but Daylin informed him that she had given him a compliment earlier. He was a little confused as he had a hard time understanding what she was talking about. Daylin smiled at the young man, knowing that her training was paying off. She said she enjoyed taking care of the little things, like adjusting a collar or pinning an accessory, and she thought that in high society, such things were considered a sign of nobility. A moment later, she looked at him with a satisfied smile and pleasure, as she already imagined how he would conquer all of high society. Daylin. Looking at the young man, she understood that if it weren't for the army where he went, no one would have believed it if they found out that he was from the 8th Detachment. Looking at the young man, she realized that in childhood he was as sweet as a prince. She sighed heavily. She knew that they had been trained from an early age. Dalen looked closely at the young man, as she understood that it was very strange that with such an appearance, he was sent to the squad. She said that probably many were against sending him to the battlefield. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't know this. She consoled herself with bewilderment and looked at him. Kel sighed heavily and said he didn't remember anything. Dalen was taken aback and said she understood everything, and at the same time, she asked him to stop. Dalen looked closely at the young man and asked if he didn't remember his childhood. He sighed heavily and said that he had no memories before joining the army. She looked at him in surprise and said that she understood everything, and also asked when he joined the army. Without changing his expression, he said that he did not know. Dalen looked at him in surprise and asked who gave him the name. He also said that he didn't know. Dalen was a little puzzled by his words and asked if that was really his name from the very beginning. Kels looked at her intently and said that it was correct. Dalen sighed heavily and asked if all the members of the squad had no memory. He said that this was not so, because some remembered everything. She remembered that she had previously heard that a mage was used in training. Dalen sighed heavily and asked the young man if he could look down. Kels looked at her with confusion. Dalen didn't think that the memories of all the squad members had been erased. She knew that magic wasn't such a simple thing that it could be easily applied to those who were going to their death. She knew it must have been an accident, or there must have been a reason to erase the memory. But she knew the reason didn't matter at all. Dalen. She sighed, because she realized that if she could bring back his memory, it would be easier to teach him manners. She really wanted to figure out this issue, because she knew that something was wrong. After the young lady used her divine power, she saw seals above the young man's head. Dalen was puzzled, because she saw that they were using different magical techniques, intricately intertwined with each other. She wondered if she would understand more if she studied this magic in more detail. But she knew that it was done a long time ago, and the most careless interference with the mind could lead to madness. Dalen understood that first she needed to study it and practice, and then see what she could do. He looked at her in surprise, as he realized that she had used sacred power. Dalen smiled and thanked the young man for sitting quietly. Dalen smiled and said that now they could begin a serious study of such things in Togo high society. He looked at her with bewilderment, but a moment later, with a fierce grin, she said that she would teach him without any indulgences, so he should prepare himself. Without changing his expression, he said that he understood and would be ready for anything. Dalen smiled and said that they would try together. Dalen looked away in my direction, as she realized that the young man was simply very boring, because she thought that he would be nervous because of one-word study. But everything was not so. She looked closely at the young man and remembered his different facial expressions. She knew that he only communicated like that in the hustle and bustle of life, with those he carried with him everywhere. Dalen looked at the young man predatorily and sighed heavily, because she knew that if she could not see his smile, then at least she would look at his tears. She sighed heavily and said that there were many unpleasant moments at social parties that he needed to know about. She knew that most of the knowledge was useless, but he still had to remember it all. She said with a smile that she supposed that, with his appearance, they would forgive him for his lack of manners. But she knew that there would be those who would find fault with him. She said with a smile that when she made her debut in society, it was a complete failure and a nightmare. For her return, she saved up money and prepared a chic costume. She, of course, thought that I would do the same for her. But, unfortunately, there is. They said that there was no money and brought an old-fashioned outfit from a distant relative. Unfortunately, she was dressed like an old aunt, and she made her debut in society without even mastering the basics of etiquette. That day, they really went psyched about her, but she tempered her character. Dalen looked at the young man with a smile and said that this was already an old story and they did not need to talk about it. She smiled and said that she shouldn't burden him with such stories. Dalen smiled and said that she would never allow him to find himself in such a situation, because no one knew better than her how to avoid gossip behind his back. She smiled and asked if he was impressed by her story. but a moment later she was taken aback, as she realized that the young man had stopped. He looked at her intently and said that he understood everything. Daylin froze for a moment and stared at him, but a moment later, the young lady approached her companion and said with a smile that she did not know at all what he was thinking about just now. But with a smile, she said that she felt that if he went out into the world, he would unconsciously turn the heads of many. Kels asked in surprise if his job was to turn people's heads. She was taken aback and said that it wasn't so, but still, in turn, wondered if he should do something like that. She said that he wouldn't be wrong, but it would be better for him to refrain from it. After some time, the young lady froze in surprise and shock, as she knew that this was simply unbelievable. Daylin was shocked and wondered if a newbie could create such a signature in a letter. She was surprised and incredibly happy, because even she saw that this signature was something special. Daylin sighed heavily and looked closely at the young man, as she knew that, from the very beginning, he was not like everyone else in learning to write. She thought she shouldn't expect too much at first, so she asked him with a smile if he would try writing the letters. She handed him the pen with a smile. A moment later, she began to pronounce different letters and tell him what to write. At that very moment, he slowly began to write and wrote the given word clearly and distinctly, but at the same time beautifully. Daylin froze in shock when she saw what he wrote and how he wrote it. A moment later, she asked him to write something else, saying that the word in question had small and large letters mixed together, and that it would be a little difficult. But looking at the book, he said that he understood and would do it. Daylin was taken aback and froze in shock when she saw what he wrote. She was surprised because she saw that he learned everything several times faster than other people. She thought about trying to create a signature for a high society guest book at once, but she didn't expect him to do it so easily. She remembered that her signature was very clear and neat. She felt very awkward when the maids who accepted her signature held back their laughter. Moments later, she came and looked at the young man with bewilderment. She remembered that those who created the signature for the aristocrat earned good money. She wondered if she should develop this talent as a business plan for her old age. She knew that she could take a small commission for creating signatures. Daylin assumed that by the time she brought the young man out into the world, she would become the high priest, so she would soon need a solid signature. Daylin was puzzled and wondered if it would be an abuse if she said that she did it herself. She was seriously lost in thought, not noticing anyone around her. Kels, in turn, looked at the young lady with bewilderment and asked what was the matter. Daylin, in turn, called out to the young man, who quickly said that he was listening to her. She looked at him intently and asked if she could ask him for something. He looked at her in surprise and said that she should first tell him what she wanted to ask him, since he should first hear her define it, and later say whether he could fulfill it. She looked at him with a happy smile and asked if he would do another signature. A little later, she looked at what he had done, puzzled. Daylin sighed heavily and said that if he didn't want to do it, he could have just said so. Kels sighed and said that he tried his best. She looked away from him and said that if he didn't want to, then there was no need, because it was a request, not an order, and he shouldn't strain himself. He said that he tried his best and still intended to try. He said he would not fail her. Failure meant death, and he began to spell. Kels knew it was a battlefield called paper. But a moment later, the young man was taken aback as he saw what he had achieved after much effort. Daylin was in shock because she saw that he just died. She screamed and called for him, but it was all in vain. Daylin was in shock because she knew it was all very serious. She screamed at him to calm down and that she didn't want anything else from him. A few days later, she looked into the distance with pleasure because she knew that it was very quiet in the palace. She was happy and at the same time enjoyed their sweet paradise. She woke up in the morning, washed herself, got dressed, and Kels was already waiting for her with food ready. Every meal was a dish prepared by Chef Kels, who cooked on his own initiative, and when he had free time, he cleaned up. She was happy because she ate wonderful food in the mansion, and there was not a single speck of dust in the mansion. At first, she felt like she was on a train whose brakes failed. She knew the road to the estate was terrible, but the further she went, the more the destination was transformed into a paradise. Daylin was well aware of the fact that now all she had to do in the estate was leisurely eat, digest, search, and read books to the young man. or teach him etiquette. She sighed heavily because she did not know what to teach him today. Dalen was very happy, as she knew that he could now read books on his own, but she understood that it was better to take a break from etiquette until the textbooks she asked the Lord for arrived. Looking at the book, she wondered if they should try again that baking that didn't work out last time. It was the moment she saw a glimmer of humanity in the genius puppy. But when she saw his creation, she asked him to forget about desserts for a while. Dalen clearly understood that desserts were not something that could be learned on one's own. She knew that he had read a lot of books, and so she had to ask if he wanted to learn something new. A moment later, she knocked on the young man's door and asked with a smile if she could come in. Without looking up from her book, he allowed her to. Dalen looked at the young man with a tender smile. She was very embarrassed and simply could not take her eyes off him, as he looked amazing. Kel sat in a chair with his legs crossed by the window, where the sunlight was pouring in, enjoying a cup of tea and not forgetting to read. Dalen was very happy with his progress, as she is an amazing priest and did everything she could for him. But a moment later, she was taken aback and looked at the young man in bewilderment, as she heard a slight noise he made. Dalen looked at the young man in surprise, as she didn't understand what had happened. Dalen was furious, because she knew from his reaction that something had happened outside again. She came closer to him and tenderly told him that everything was fine, and he didn't need to be so angry. She hugged him tenderly and asked him to calm down, as she knew that everything would calm down soon. She was puzzled, as she knew that he had learned everything quickly, but unfortunately, nervousness is not so easy to get rid of quickly. She understood that if she didn't stand in this position for long, he would quickly calm down. But a moment later, the young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she saw that her plan was not working. She was very much alarmed, and looking at the young man, she wondered if there really was something outside. A moment later, she heard a knock on the door and turned around in fear. Dalen looked at the door with worry, since they weren't expecting any guests at all. Dalen knew perfectly well that the people they knew who were supposed to come to them today wouldn't knock like that. She sighed heavily, as she could not see anything from the window, so she asked the young man to come down with her and see what was the matter, since she knew that a man had knocked on their door. She asked if he remembered what she had taught him. Dalen looked at the young man and asked what he needed to do when he heard a knock on the door. Kel said irritably that he needed to find out who it was by the voice, and then decide whether to let that person out or not. He wanted to object, but still sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. Dalen was worried, because she heard that during the war, many attempts were made on his battalion. It seemed to her that life had been too calm lately. She was puzzled, because she understood that some nonsense had happened. Dalen was worried and wondered what she would do if ill-wishers came knocking at the door. She wondered if she should tell the young man to face her. Dalen was taken aback and pushed all such thoughts away, as she knew that it would negate all her efforts and return the young man to the master-dog relationship from which she had diligently tried to wean him. Dalen pushed the young man away and asked him to stay put, as she intended to deal with the matter herself. He looked at her in surprise, but did not answer. She smiled and said that he did not need to look at her so pitifully. A moment later, she said with a satisfied smile that she had, in general, the power. She knew that she could quickly fry anyone, and she could do it, because no one saw them. And in the end, God gave her this ability so that she could protect herself. She understood that it was very strange, because she did not hear the sounds of a struggle, because the door was guarded. A moment later, she approached the door and quietly asked who was knocking on their door. The young man sighed heavily and informed the priestess that it was he who had come. She looked at the door in bewilderment. A moment later, she opened the door and froze in surprise, as she did not expect to see the young man at all. Lauren, with a smile, apologized for not warning her in advance. But, unfortunately, they had an emergency. He smiled and asked if he could come inside. She was taken aback, but had already let him in. But a moment later, she opened the door wide and froze in surprise, as she saw Knights and another young man. Living in peace for some time, she completely forgot that difficult life trials awaited her at every step. Kells, in turn, looked at the young people with fury. The young lady was shocked, as she realized that God was sending them tests in the most unexpected forms. Kels looked at everyone present with fury and said that he would not let them in. The young people looked at him in bewilderment, but he insisted on his own, as he did not want to let them inside. The Lord looked at the young man closely and asked him to do it just once with a smile. But he looked at the Lord with all his fury and firmly said that he would not let the young man into them. Dalen sighed heavily and told the Lord that if they tried to pass, he would tear them all to pieces. She was puzzled, because she didn't even know what she could come up with to make him miss them. But she couldn't ignore the pleading looks of the poor soldiers. She was puzzled, because she understood that she would have to do this in front of everyone. She understood that she would think about the rest later. Dalen slowly approached her charge and, hugging him, asked him to calm down, but he was unmoved. The Lord looked at the young lady in bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was doing at all. She looked at him sideways and gave him a sign. She held the young man back with all her might as they led their new charge inside. Dalen looked closely at the young man, seeing his strange reaction to the big guy, who looked like he had been in a fight. She wondered if he was also from the 8th Battalion. Dalen sighed heavily and asked Kels to calm down a little, saying that they could go to the room. She hoped that the Lord had some strange business with her. But the matter turned out to be even stranger than she had expected. Taking care of her ward, she looked at the Lord with a smile and said that it was simply impossible. On his knees, the Lord asked why she didn't want to do the same. She smiled and said that they don't always get what they want. He looked at her pleadingly, telling her she needed to think about it a little longer. Dalen sighed heavily and looked at the young man with a smile. She knew that since he'd asked so, she should at least pretend to consider his question. She looked around intently and thought about everything in the world, but she knew that her decision would remain unchanged. She looked intently at the Lord and said that she would not take another soldier from the battalion. She sighed heavily and said that her protégé was a dandelion compared to the new fighter, because she had previously heard that the man had killed other priests. She sighed heavily and said that Kels couldn't stand the young man. She looked at the Lord intently and told him to look at the young man and his reaction, since she knew that he clearly did not like all this. Lauren sighed heavily and told the young lady that he had no one else to turn to but her. He knew that if she refused him, it would be God himself who commanded it. He looked at her intently and said that she too was expected to be investigated. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that she should judge for herself. If she refused him, they would set him free. But at the same time, they all understood that he was like a walking bomb, and if she left him now, then he would become a national heroine. He sighed heavily and said that otherwise she should wait for a response. She was in shock, wondering if they would really kill her for something like this. She screamed that it was completely unfair, since she did not understand who made such a stupid decision. Dalen was puzzled, because she knew that she and her ward had come a long way. And just when she was calming down, fate decided to throw a curveball at her. The Lord looked at her closely and asked her not to worry too much, as nothing terrible would happen. He also told her that the young people had served together in the army. He said that he was not asking her to follow him on a permanent basis, since this was a temporary measure until they found another priest. Lauren looked closely at the young lady and said that the young man did not need to be prepared for his debut. She just had to keep him in the house and make sure he didn't cause trouble outside. Dalen, in turn, thought for a moment. As her inner self struggled with her, she did not know what choice to make, but she knew she could make more money. But now she was acting like an amateur. The Lord looked at her intently and said that, of course, the maintenance fee would be increased several times. Dalen sighed heavily and said that it was too obvious, since several people required several times more work. He smiled and said that the maintenance fee would double and the additional allowances would quadruple. She stood there with a satisfied smile, saying that God told them to help those in need. So she agreed with his proposal. At the same time, Kels froze in shock on the spot, as he did not expect such a thing. The Lord, in turn, was very happy, since she agreed, and relieved him of his headache. He shouted that she was his savior. Dalen was puzzled, because she knew she would be the one in the worst position in this situation, but she knew she simply had no choice, and she consoled herself with the fact that she would receive money as a consolation prize, and good money at that. Sometime later, the young people approached one of the rooms of the estate, as they knew that the soldiers had put him in this room. Kels looked closely at the young lady and asked her not to come close to him. Dalian smiled and said that everything would be fine, because the young man was sleeping under tranquilizers. She slowly opened the door, and at the same time, Kels said that it was not so. She turned around and looked at him in surprise, as the young man said that he woke up. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback, as she heard some kind of crash. Turning around, she froze in shock, as she saw that a young man with fury in his eyes was flying straight at her. Kels moved towards the young man with lightning speed and used his power to stop him, as he did not want the priestess to be hurt. The young man was burning with anger and fury and shouted at his opponent that he could not deceive him. Kels looked at the young man with cold fury and said that he was being too loud. The young man was filled with anger and fury, and he dealt his opponent blow after blow, but this only made him angrier. A moment later, they rose from the ground and took a stance. They argued among themselves for a few minutes, but after a while, they flew at each other in anger. The young man shouted at his opponent that he was just a mad dog. Kels, in turn, was filled with rage and shouted at the young man not to say such things about him. At the same time, the priestess of the Wasp looked at the young men in surprise as they fought without a break. And moreover, she was surprised, as they even talked in parallel. She looked closely at the young men and wondered if she should stop them. She didn't know, so she wondered if they had a similar manner of communication. She was a little worried, as the young man had earlier given her a whistle to control halt. He had told her in all seriousness that she should use the whistle in case of extreme danger. She sighed heavily and looked closely at the young people, as she saw that her protégé was beating the newcomer with all his might, and he, in turn, was screaming as if he was in great pain. At the same time, the young man swore very loudly. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew that it was better for her not to interfere in such showdowns. She looked at them intently, as she did not think at all that this was an extreme case of danger. Kels beat Helt until he went silent. The young lady looked closely at the young man and asked how Halt was doing. He sighed heavily, but ignored her question. A moment later, he looked closely at his companion and said that the young man had finally fallen silent. She sighed heavily and asked if he was hurt anywhere, and if he was in pain. Kels looked at her intently and said that he was fine, and she didn't need to worry about such things. She looked at the young man with concern and said that she had been told earlier that they had never had such clashes before. Kels said that he was holding back because of orders, and then he was much more humble than today. She sighed heavily and asked if they were really going to continue fighting like this. Kels sighed heavily and said that he didn't know that. He said that they were trying to suppress the will of the battalion's fighters in every possible way, and the resentment was building up, and this especially concerned Halt. Kels said the young man was good at surprise attacks and useful for assassinations. He had a very persistent temperament and was hard to ignore. Kels said that those who can't be controlled need to be dealt with. He looked intently at the young man and said in all seriousness that if something like this happened again, he would immediately deal with him, even to the point of murder. She sighed heavily as she realized that her charge had decided not to finish off the young man for now. She looked at him closely as she realized that from the angle she had created, one might think that he was actually dead. Looking at her charge, she said that he should discard this option as a last resort. Dalen sighed heavily and, reaching out to the young man, asked him to resolve the issue less radically. She said that they would sort everything out gradually. He sighed heavily, but still agreed. He was furious and knew he needed to find the softest rope he could find to tie him up when he woke up, but to do it as gently as possible. A moment later, the young lady looked at the newcomer with fear, as she saw that he had suddenly woken up. After some time, Kels ran after the newcomer, as he wanted to include him in his warm vow. After several hours of continuous racing and fighting, Kels finally managed to catch the young man, and in doing so, he tied him up. Halt, at the same time, ate the dish with pleasure and asked if Kels had really prepared it. Halt, in turn, was amazed, as he saw that the dish was seriously very tasty. Looking at the priestess, he asked if it was really she who taught the young man to cook so well. She looked at him in surprise and said that one could say so, but she knew that he did well without her. She looked at the young man in surprise and asked if he could really tell that the food tasted good. Halt looked at her in surprise and said that since he had a tongue, that meant he could do it. He asked if not everyone could do it. Dalen glanced sideways at her charge and asked if he could do it. He thought about it for a moment, but after a few seconds, he firmly answered no. She knew that his reaction only occurred when there was something really disgusting in the food. Dalen looked closely at the young man and knew that on other occasions he did not enjoy the taste of zero reaction, like a ghost. She supposed that perhaps this was the case with all the fighters in the battalion, but looking at the newcomer, she saw that her judgment was wrong. She looked at him intently and asked if he could hear her heartbeat or the sound of a bird flying past. He looked at her in surprise when he heard her heartbeat. Dalen looked closely at the young man and asked if he was okay. Hal was taken aback for a moment, not understanding what she was talking about. He hesitated and said that he hadn't really thought about it. She looked at him intently and said that everything was fine. He didn't need to answer right away. He sighed heavily, as he was a little puzzled, because she was talking to him like a dog again. He sighed heavily and said that he was a dog. She smiled and asked for forgiveness, and also said that she would not talk to him like that anymore. Looking at the young man, she said that with Kels, it was completely different. She said that she didn't consider him a dog at all. The young man looked at her intently and said with a smile that she was cool. She smiled and thanked him for such a compliment. Dalen glared at the newcomer and asked if he could please stop staring at her like that. He was taken aback and looked away from her, but at the same time he began to mumble something to himself. Dalen looked closely at the young man, as she could see that he definitely had social skills, and at the same time she felt awkward calling him a mad dog. They had a nice conversation for a while, as he wanted to call her his cool sister, and he also asked if she would loosen his ropes. She smiled and said she would think about it. Dalen sighed heavily, and looking at the young man, said that with Kelson, they turned out to be different, despite the fact that they went through the same training and procedures, even magic. He sighed heavily and said that it was a business matter for a friend, because he was basically different from other dogs. Looking at the young lady, he said that it was because he joined the army at an older age, and thus others required more training and procedures than him. Dalen was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Dalen knew that Kels had been subjected to a lot of procedures and spells, and even when she tried to ask the former military lord about it, he tried his best to avoid answering, because the person who was in charge of training the battalion was a big shot, namely a member of the Imperial Army, an informal order that said nothing about magic or procedures, and only the performer or the recipient could know what it was. Her attempts to get the Lord to talk resulted in several hours of completely useless chatter. She looked closely at the young man, as she realized that perhaps he would give her a clue to the mysterious procedures that Kels had undergone. She looked at him intently, and with a joyful smile asked if he knew anything about those procedures. Halt looked at the young lady with bewilderment and asked how he knew what they used on them. He sighed heavily and said that it was not suitable for this conversation. After all, she knew little about magic. She looked at him intently, asking if he knew at least approximately why everything was being done. At the same time, Kels, with restrained rage, looked at them. Halt said that they wanted to sharpen their senses. She smiled and asked if he knew anything else. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't know anything, because at first he tried to avoid all this. But then, being on the battlefield, it became downright unbearable. Then he told them that they could do whatever they wanted with him. It would help him survive. Dalen was a little puzzled and wondered why she hadn't realized it right away. Halt said that those who couldn't stand it and threw tantrums were killed. She understood only now that there was no place for common sense on the battlefield. Halt said that those who were not worth killing were taken, and their memories were erased. She looked closely at her charge, as she realized that he would never become a peaceful, sane person. Fortunately, the conversation with my young man went quite far, although not enough to find out the whole truth, but he told her about many of his memories. Kels was irritated, But it seems he gradually got used to the presence of a new man in their house. She knew that all she could do was calmly wait for the new curator, which was exactly what she had planned to do. But unfortunately, things did not go according to her plan. Taken aback, she asked the young people how long they were going to behave like this. Kels was furious and shouted that he would behave like this until the young man left them. Helt, bursting into tears, shouted to the young lady that he was afraid of a mad dog. She sighed heavily, as she was puzzled by everything that was happening, because she saw that they were arguing with anger. Dalen sighed heavily and said that soon she would give her soul to God. She was in shock and didn't understand how it had come to this, but in order to explain everything, it was necessary to go back a few days. Halt was happy because the ropes were removed from him. He smiled and said that it was very surprising that Kels knew how to cook, and the food was also delicious. He smiled and said that the priests were truly amazing. She smiled and said that the young man simply studied hard. She smiled and said that maybe before the memory erasure, he knew how to do something like that. Halt said with a grin that no one knows if this is true, and maybe before joining the squad, he lived in some mansion. Halt looked at the young man with a smirk and said that he really had been damn handsome since childhood, and he was surprised and wondered how such a handsome man came to them. But he knew that if the young man was an aristocrat, then all his assumptions came true. Dalen looked closely at the young man and asked if he remembered when Kels first joined their squad. Halt looking at the young lady, he said that he remembered everything, and the young man came with his memory completely erased. She was surprised. He said that he thought he was transferred from some other combat zone. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he could really tell from just one glance that the young man's memory had been completely erased. She asked if he could describe specifically how this was determined. Halt sighed heavily and said that a fool can be seen with the naked eye. He said that the young man had forgotten how to speak, had forgotten how to live, did not know how to sleep, and did not know how to eat. Halt said, puzzled, that he looked more like a beast. He was always afraid that she was a battlefield. The young man would cut everyone. Halt said that even when they went wild, some still went crazy and had their memories erased again, but that didn't happen with the young man. Kels sighed heavily and said that was exactly how it was. Dalen looked at them intently and asked if there would be a problem if they erased their memory in an hour. He said with a grin that there would be a problem if they repeated it too many times. People could become complete idiots, and then they could die, going crazy on the battlefield. He said that the young people would have died anyway, just a little later. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it wasn't unpleasant for him to look at this, since they had been comrades for a long time. He smiled and asked what kind of comrades they were talking about, if, on order, they could kill each other at any moment. Dalen was a little puzzled and didn't know what she could say to him in this situation, since they themselves spoke about it so carelessly. Halt smiled and said that a young man came to their squad and looked like a baby, but he thought that he would soon kill him. He looked predatorily at the young man and said that he had survived, and now they had met again. The young lady, in turn, looked warily at the young man. She quickly took Kels's arm, thus protecting him and calming him down. Dalen looked closely at the young men and asked them to calm down, because they emitted a murderous aura. She glanced sideways at the young men and said that they had previously told her that they had not fought in the detachment. She was surprised and did not understand why they were suddenly fighting about her. They had decided to do it once. They had previously communicated normally. Halt sighed heavily and said that he did not know this, because when he saw the young man, he immediately wanted to hit him. Kels looked intently after the young man and said that there are people with whom you just wanted to fight. Dalen was shocked by this statement. She didn't understand what was wrong with handsome young people. She saw that Kels, out of nowhere, began to stare at Halt, but Halt, in turn, also reacted very strangely to the young man. She was puzzled and wondered if he only reacted this way to her charge. Halt, in turn, said irritably and angrily that the young man's very look had already infuriated him. Halt turned around and looked at the young man with angry rage, because everything about him infuriated him, and therefore he shouted and cursed at him with rage. Kels shielded the young lady with his body and asked her to move away. She was shocked, looking at the young people, because she understood that if he now clashed with the newcomer, then she would have problems. She understood that if they only flew out the window, she would lose control over them. Halt rushed towards the young man with cold fury and anger, as if he wanted to fight him. Dalen quickly walked up to the young man and grabbed him, hugging Kels. She screamed that he didn't need to fight and wanted to calm him down. He looked at her sideways and in surprise, as he did not expect this. She was in shock as she understood that it was too late to stop them. Halt froze in place in surprise and looked at his opponent with bewilderment, while Dalen, in turn, slowly opened her eyes. She looked at the young man in bewilderment, as she saw that nothing had happened. A moment later, he turned around, and she saw a large bruise on his face. Dalen froze in shock and looked at him in confusion as she realized he had been hit. Dalen and Halt looked at Kels with bewilderment, and in one voice asked if he had just been hit and he had taken the blow. Kels, without changing his expression, looked intently at the young lady and said that it was exactly like that. Halt was in shock and could not understand what had happened, as his opponent simply took the blow from the fist that was flying straight into his face. Dayline looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not understand why he himself was so surprised. After all, he had hit his opponent himself. Dayline looked at them with bewilderment, as she knew that she shouldn't just stand there and watch everything, as she knew that she wouldn't be able to hold them back for long. She knew she had to get down to business. Dalen slowly approached the young man and asked him to calm down. He shouted and insulted her with rage because he did not understand why she suddenly started giving him orders. But a moment later, the young lady managed to grab his hand and said with a smirk that they could at least try. Dalen looked at the young man with a happy smile and said that they could do it, calling him brother. Looking at the young man, she realized what he was doing. She knew that if Kels was a beast, then Halt was a pain in the ass. She knew very well that very different people came to the temple, and many were problematic clients. They always had one thing in common, namely rolling their eyes. She knew that it was simply impossible to come to an agreement with them. Dalen clearly understood that there was an easy way to deal with people like this. She had to suppress them with her spirit. Dalen looked closely at the young man, and with a joyful smile, said that he was the one who had overcome so many troubles and trials, survived on the battlefield. She shouted that he was brave, so he could overcome everything else too. He looked at her in surprise and said that perhaps this was so. She smiled and shouted that he should cope. She wanted him to feel the joy of meeting the world. She said that he would be able to curb his fighting spirit, and at the same time, she used her sacred power on him. He was surprised because he didn't expect her to use spiritual power, but she knew it would be useless. She wouldn't even try. He sighed heavily and asked, puzzled, why spiritual power was needed. Dalen looked at the young man with a smile and said that she was doing everything to calm him down. He looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected this. He smiled and said that he didn't remember the last time he felt this way. He shouted that she was very capable and special. She smiled and said that she really was skilled. In his joy, the young man lifted her into the air. He shouted that she was truly skilled, because it was the first time since the war that he had experienced such calm. She was in shock, because she had not expected such a thing. He shouted with joy that even the feeling of crawling insects had disappeared, and he felt as if another eye had opened. He was in shock and did not understand how she had done such a thing. Daleen smiled and said she didn't do anything special. Daleen thought of her charge with a smile, but she found it pleasant to watch someone shine and grow so brightly right before her eyes. But a moment later, she was taken aback as someone pulled her. Kels, with lightning speed, took the young lady into his arms and hugged her tightly. He growled and looked at his opponent with ferocious rage. Halt looked at the young man with fury and asked if he was really looking for a fight. Dalen was taken aback and asked them to calm down. Dalen looked at Halt intently and said with a smile that he had just calmed down. She asked them not to fight. A moment later, she looked at the young people with a happy smile and asked if they could talk over lunch. But still the young people looked at each other warily. Dalen smiled and asked if they were good dogs, since she knew they wouldn't talk while they were eating. Halt looked away from the young lady. She was glad that he had managed to calm down. A moment later, she looked at Kels with a gentle smile, wanting to see his answer. Kels, in turn, drooped and sighed heavily, saying that he would do everything as she said. Dalen looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not understand his reaction. She was puzzled because it seemed to her that she was standing between two rocks, and at that moment she realized what she had done. Several more days passed after this incident. Halt, unfortunately, was constantly going crazy for no reason, and they all saw it. He looked at the young man with fury and asked him why he was looking at him like that. She sighed heavily as they were arguing again. At first, she thought he was just nervous. She knew it happened to everyone, but she knew a saying that smart dogs were more loyal, and they caused more trouble. She was very puzzled, as she saw that the young man was even digging up a stone that was simply lying on the ground. She understood perfectly well that he could argue with anyone, and it was none of her business. But the problem was that his emotions were easily transmitted to Kels, and he in turn became very angry, and she had to calm him down. She thought that he was deliberately provoking her charge, so she calmly asked the young man to calm down. But she saw that it was all in vain, since he even dug into the clouds. Dalen sighed heavily and looked closely at the young man, as she could see that he had completely lost his mind, and soon she realized that he really had gone crazy. As he glared at the young man and shouted at him to attack him immediately, he wanted to hurt Kels with his insults and provoke him into a fight. Dalen looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not understand his behavior. Kels, in turn, was probably listening to the young lady. She was puzzled, since it seemed that the young man had become more capricious, and she assumed that it was all because he tolerated Halt's presence. Dalen smiled and sighed heavily. She didn't know what to do with their pestle, because she knew that soon he would be independent. She wondered if he had suffered a lot in his childhood. After all, he loved when they stroked his head. She smiled and said that they needed to calm Huddle down, and then she would stroke him some more. Kels looked at the young lady intently and said that he understood everything. Dalen immediately rushed to the young man and told her charge that everything would be fine. But before she could take a step, the young man pulled her towards him. She looked at the young people with bewilderment, as they were very wary. Kels said with alarm that someone was approaching the house. She was surprised and asked if the Lord was already heading towards them. He sighed heavily and said that he could not see anything. But at the same time, he was taken aback and quickly turned around, because at that very moment the glass broke and a hail of arrows flew at them. With the speed of lightning, he rushed towards the young priestess, and with his quick reaction, he saved her life. She was shocked because she saw an iron arrow. At that very moment, she saw Halt rush to the broken window. She was shocked and screamed for him to stop immediately, but it was all in vain as he jumped out of the window with ease. At that moment, the young lady rushed towards the young man, but Kels stopped her and shouted that it was very dangerous. Dalen looked closely at the young man and said that she clearly understood that it was dangerous, but she knew that they couldn't leave Halt, because the worst thing would be if he went outside in this state and started acting up. She looked intently at the young man and said that they needed to catch up with him quickly. Kelsfave looked at the young lady intently, as he realized that he would not be able to stop her. A few seconds later, he threw her over his shoulder. He sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. She was taken aback in a way she had not expected, but after a few seconds they easily jumped out of the window. She was in shock because she wanted to run, but not like this. She knew that it didn't matter at all, and the main thing was that his legs were very fast, not like hers. Dalen sighed heavily because she understood that now she was just a sack of potatoes, so she didn't need to jerk around. A moment later, the young man was taken aback as he heard some noise. After a few seconds, he stopped after running continuously and informed the young lady that he heard a suspicious sound. Dalen sighed heavily and, looking into the distance, said that it was very good that the young man did not climb over the fence. She was very puzzled and worried, because she understood that this time she should not count on luck. She understood what would happen if her ward also went crazy after Halt. She was excited because she realized that she would have to use the whistle, which she did not want to use. But a moment later, she was taken aback because the whistle was not around her neck. She was shocked and said that this was a very bad situation. Dalen was puzzled because she hadn't used them in a while and had left them on her vanity. Dalen was furious and was quarreling with herself because she didn't know when she would need them, so she just left them Kels left the lady and said he would come closer. Daylin was taken aback because she didn't want him to do something like that. She wondered if he meant to say he would come back and get him. She grabbed his clothes and asked him to be careful. At that very moment, the young man was menacingly mischievous, looking into the distance. She hoped that he would hold on with all his might. But a moment later, they saw a truly terrible picture. Halt stood in front of them, covered in blood, and looked at his opponent with fury. A moment later, he looked at his opponent with a fierce grin, and at the same moment rushed towards him. Halt was very angry, and he also attacked his opponent with a grin, as he wanted to deal with him as quickly as possible. Daylin froze in shock as she realized things were worse than she had imagined. She understood that if the young man hit her even once, he would win. But she saw that because he was unarmed against the knife, he was seriously wounded. Daylin looked at the young man and wondered if she should just give up and run away. She sighed heavily and realized that it was better for her to do nothing than to just run away. At the same time, she told her friend that everything was okay and he needed to calm down. She sighed heavily as she simply could not just up and leave them. So at that very moment, she used her power. She directed her power at their enemy and, sighing heavily, said that it would all be over soon. At that very moment, the young man fell to the ground with a crash and began to scream, as his eyes glowed with sacred fire. She sighed heavily and looked at the young man with sadness, as she had not done anything like this for a long time. Daylin was puzzled, as she had only used this method in desperate situations during the war. Daylin thought for a moment and remembered the arrow wound, as she was sure that the arrow was definitely flying at her. She knew that it was just self-defense, so God would forgive her. Moments later, she looked intently at the young man and called out to him. She sighed heavily, knowing she had to get them back to the mansion. At that very moment, she caught her charge and hugged him tightly, just as she wanted him to be calm. Daylin was puzzled, as she knew that it would make things a little easier for her if she could calm Halt down as well. But unfortunately, she knew that such a moment wouldn't work with him. She looked at the young man in bewilderment as she saw that he was bursting with anger. She thought he was shaking with rage, but after a few seconds, she realized that was not the case. Daylin looked at the young man in bewilderment and called him over, knowing that he had survived the war with his mind intact. She understood that he knew more than anyone else, so she understood that strange things were even more frightening when the man knew about them in advance. Daylin looked closely at the young man and said that she was fine. She knew that when a person was gripped by terror, then ordinary things seemed frightening. She understood that the young man was raging because he was scared. At that very moment, she hugged him tightly and said that there were no more murderers because they had all been defeated. Daylin said that no one would attack them again. She said that they didn't need to fight because they were safe. He looked at her tremblingly and asked if they had really killed everyone and were now safe. She smiled a tender smile and said that everything was true and that they were now safe. Daylin looked closely at the young man, as she saw that he was already speaking like a human being. She was glad that everything was going smoothly, but a moment later, she was taken aback and looked at him with bewilderment. She was shocked because the young man, looking into her hysterical eyes, burst into tears. At that very moment, he burst into tears and screamed and cried hysterically. Daylin froze in shock, not expecting anything like this. She was surprised and didn't know what to do. He cried and screamed that he was in pain and that all his wounds hurt. Unfortunately, she didn't know then what her actions would lead to, because at the same time, Kels was looking at them with fury and could barely contain himself. The young man was screaming that he was very scared. She hugged him and said that it was completely normal and everything was fine. He didn't need to be afraid of anything anymore. She understood that the hugs and pats on the back were working, and she said that they needed to go home. Hugging him, she used her divine power. But at that very moment, she was pulled away from the young man. She was surprised, as she did not understand what was happening at all. Halt, in turn, was taken aback and reached for the young lady. She was in shock as Kels pulled her away from the young man and glared at him. Kels shouted furiously that he would not give up the young lady. She was shocked and did not understand why he suddenly started behaving like this. He squeezed her tighter and shouted that he would not give her up. She was in shock and screaming, asking the young man to let her go because she could not breathe. Daylin was in shock, asked the young man to let her go and calm down, but he shouted that he would not let her go and would not give her to anyone. She shouted that he had to let her go right now, because she could suffocate. Dalen sighed heavily as he loosened his grip a little. She said that now that her life was no longer in danger, they could go home. She looked intently and with bewilderment at the young man, who, looking at her, was bursting into bitter tears. Dalen looked at the young man with a smile and asked if they weren't coming back. She was shocked and wondered what was going on and why he was behaving like this. Dalen was puzzled as the young man started crying even worse. The young girl was beautiful, like a flower between two muscular men. She knew it sounded very sexy, like a romantic scene. But in reality, everything was a little different. She got the role of a cutlet in a sandwich, which was squeezed from both sides. That same evening, guests came to them. She looked at the Lord in surprise and asked if they were really taking him away today. The Lord smiled and said that it was true. It was very sudden, but they were all very lucky, because there was a person who was ready to replace her. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that it was very good, because she managed to put him to sleep. He smiled and said that yesterday's tooth was even good for them. The Lord looked closely at the young lady and asked how the young man had behaved today. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer, but looking at Halt, who was being packed for transportation, she said that he began to behave much better. Looking at the Lord, she said that the young man did not need to be tied up so tightly. He smiled and said that they were doing this just in case, because they could not know what would happen on the road, but thanks to her strength, he would no longer be afraid on the way back. He looked at her hard and said that she must now give him the whistle back, and he would go. Dalen looked intently at the young man and obediently gave him the whistle. Returning to the mansion, the young man talked to her a little. He was puzzled because, unfortunately, he had gone off the rails. He thought that everything would be fine, because he had become much better since he came to them. Dalen looked at her companion in surprise and asked if he really felt better. He sighed heavily and said that it was true, but he still stumbled, which happens to everyone, but he was still very upset. He said that before, when he was so pressed, his eyes would pop out of his head, steam would come out of his ears, but now he has learned to control himself. He was surprised, because his head was clear, and it seemed to him that this was the most adequate state he had ever been in his life. He said with a smile that even if the dog provoked him now, he would not fall for such provocations. But in turn, he began to provoke the young man. Dalen looked at him intently and asked him to calm down, since she wanted to do without this. He smiled and agreed with her, and also said that if she says it's not necessary, then it's true. He said with a satisfied smile that since arriving at the mansion, he began to sleep for as many as 3 hours. Dalen looked at him in surprise and asked if that time was really enough for him. Kel sighed heavily and said that military men like Halt were supposed to get very little sleep, as their job was to hide and raid. Halt glared at the young man and asked why he was answering for him. Kels held back his rage as he glared at the young man and told him to shut his mouth. Sometime later, they got into a fight again and started arguing. Dalen looked at the young people with a smile, as she knew that Kels had a similar reaction because she hugged Halt. Dalen knew full well that possession of a priestess was a common occurrence, so she wanted them not to quarrel. Halt looked at the young man with fury and asked who he was to tell him what to do. He sighed heavily and said that it was just kindergarten. He looked at the young men and said that the dog had turned into a puppy. He wondered if it was evolution or degeneration. They looked at him intently, but did not answer. She looked closely at the young man, because she knew that he himself was feeling better, and this made her happy. She looked at him with a smile and asked if he wanted her to help him sleep better. Halt looked at her with a joyful smile and asked if she was really capable of such a thing. She smiled and said that she was capable, but unfortunately, she could not do such a thing every day. But today he was scared, so she could use her power against him, because this was a special occasion. Dalen said she thought lack of sleep affected his emotions, so if he slept better, his mood would improve. He smiled and asked how much higher he could go, because at this rate he was not far from being a saint. She smiled and said that it was okay to dream. After her words, she poured some divine power into him and put him to sleep. She knew that if he had been conscious, they could have said a proper goodbye. Dalen stared at the carriage as it drove away. She sighed heavily, as she wished to forget about the arrows that were aimed at her and the Lord who rushed to them before she could send the message. She would like to forget about the real knights who arrived with him. Dalen Yi sighed heavily and told the young man that it was time for them to go back. She slowly walked back to the house, and at the same time she wondered if everything would be okay. She sincerely hoped that everything would be just like that. That same evening, the young man came to his master and informed him that he had taken halt, as he had said. The young man looked closely at his subordinate and thanked him for a job well done. He would like to wipe them off the face of the earth, but he still knew that they were painfully competent, and he felt sorry to do it. Lauren, kneeling, asked if he should send more knights there. The young man said that there was no need to do that yet, because if he was not a fool, he would stay ready. He looked at the young man and said that he should try to talk to him, and if that didn't work, then who should send someone else? He looked at the Lord closely and said that he was lucky to have the chance to serve him, and it was the grace of the gods. He asked the young man to stand up, since he could not see his face. The Lord bowed and thanked the master for such a favor. He smiled and said that he really hoped to see him again soon. The Lord smiled and said that it was a great honor for him. At the same time, he looked closely at His Highness. Looking at the Lord, he said that they would end here. Also, His Highness, looking at the Lord, said that if he next time sends anyone, he must make sure that he does not have imperial insignia. The next day, the young lady looked at the Lord in bewilderment and asked if he had brought another one. The Lord looked at them with a satisfied smile. Lauren looked at the young people with a satisfied smile and introduced them to their new chef. He also introduced the new manager who came with them. Lauren looked at the young lady with a happy smile and said that thanks to her spiritual achievements, they were able to hire staff. He smiled and said that they were one step closer to creating a real young master. She smiled and thanked him for such praise. Dalen looked at the young man with a smile and said that it would be excellent if he kept his distance. He was taken aback and looked at the young man with bewilderment, who was glaring at him with a look mixed with anger. At that moment, the young lord moved away from the young lady with lightning speed. He smiled and said that it seemed like the young man was still quite sensitive. Dalen looked at him with a smile and said that he did not need to move so far away. The Lord smiled and said that when the manager had examined the young man's condition, the rest of the people would arrive. He smiled and said that call a certain number of people. He was glad and said that the young lady was sent to them by the gods. She looked at him with a smile and asked him not to forget to mention this in the work report. The Lord said with a satisfied smile that he only used carefully selected phrases. She smiled as she was glad about this. The Lord looked closely at the young lady and said that it was time for him to leave. She smiled, thanked him, and also wished him a good journey. After the last incident, there was a certain distance between her and the young lord. Not too close, not too far, just right for an executive or middle manager. She understood that there was no need to cut it again. A moment later, she turned her gaze to the young man. She wondered if he had become more sensitive. Because of his nagging, she couldn't even earn change from the security guards lately. Until recently, Lord Mock would only speak when Kels hugged her. She understood perfectly well that this could not continue, so she actively raised him. Dalen sighed and asked the young man if he was really going to continue hanging only on her. She said that it was impossible to do that, but he looked at her with puppy dog eyes, as he hoped that she would give the go-ahead. But the young lady was adamant and categorically said that this was not possible. Madame looked at them intently. Dalen was taken aback and screamed in fear, as she had completely forgotten who the dash was next to. She remembered that in front of other people, she should call him young master. The madam smiled and said that everything was fine, and she didn't need to worry, because she completely understood the young master's personal preferences. Dalen looked at her with bewilderment, because she didn't understand what was going on. She smiled and said that there are many young gentlemen who want to live on a leash. She said with a smile that they do not need to say anything, because she is a professional in this. Dalen was shocked and said that this is not so. She looked at them with a smile and said that she would keep your strictest secret and their intimate personal life. Dalen was taken aback and looking at the madame said that she had understood everything wrong. The madam looked closely at the young lady and said that in order to find other specialists, they would need to measure various parameters of the young master. Madame asked if they minded if she disturbed them for a moment. Dalen looked at the lady with bewilderment, as she did not understand what was being discussed. She smiled and said that they would check the diet, skin condition, body size, and so on. Dalen looked at Madame with worry and asked if they would have to get close and touch the young master. In that case, Madame smiled and said that it was inevitable. Dalen looked closely at her new friend and asked if he minded, since they had to do something like this. Dalen, looking at the young man, said that if it was too unpleasant for him, they could do it later. The madam looked at them in surprise and asked if the young gentleman didn't like it when strangers touched him. Dalen sighed and said that it was true and he was very sensitive to touch. Madam sighed heavily and said that muscle massage, skin care, cosmetic procedures, all this would be difficult to do without touching the body. Now she understood why the salary was so high. Dalen looked at Madame with a smile, because she knew that she had misunderstood everything, because it was a bonus for risking life. The madam smiled, looking at the saint, and said that if she touched the young man with them, then everything would be fine. Dalen looked at her with bewilderment, as she did not understand what was being discussed. Madame said that since the young gentleman did not like being touched by strangers, perhaps the presence of someone close would help the situation. Dalen, looking away, said that maybe he would get used to it with time. She was puzzled, because she knew that new people had been brought to his house to work, but, unfortunately, they had added to her worries. The madame looked closely at the young lady and said that the client should not be forced to get used to it, because they needed to find the most comfortable way for him. She really wanted to get to work as quickly as possible. Looking at the young gentleman, she asked if he didn't mind. Kels sighed heavily and said that if it was an order, he would carry it out. The young lady, in turn, wanted to hear a refusal from him. Madame looked at the young gentleman with her joyful smile, as she knew that his determination was excellent. At the same moment, she opened her luxurious suitcase and informed them that I would like to demonstrate my blazing professionalism to them. She looked closely at the young people and said that, to begin with, they could lightly check the elasticity of their skin, determine its type, select their shades, and also diagnose the health of their hair. Kels glanced sideways at the saint and asked if this training was really under torture. She sighed heavily and said that it wasn't, but at least it wasn't like that now. Some time later, they sat exhausted on a chair, as Madame had given them a stormy morning. The lady thanked them with a smile for their work, and also said that they would carefully select and send specialists to them. The lady examined the young man thoroughly, from pores to hair. By the end, he no longer understood what exactly Madame was studying. Kels sighed heavily and asked the young lady if this was really the young master's duty. The young lady, in turn, was no less tired. She sighed heavily and said that perhaps this was the case, and that was the reason why they had sent people to them. She was surprised because she learned that there were separate specialists in hair care and hairstyles. She was shocked and wondered what the concept of a young master meant. She wondered if a young master should not be looked after less than a noble young lady. A moment later, Madame came up to them and informed them that it was almost time for dinner. She looked at them intently and asked if they would like some chocolate while she prepared everything for dinner. Dalen was taken aback and looked at Madame in surprise. In a hurry, she called out and asked Madame how long she had been standing right in front of them. Dalen looked at the young man in surprise and worriedly asked if he hadn't noticed her either. He sighed heavily and said that Madame had been there all this time and that she was next to them. The young lady was shocked because she hadn't noticed her and he hadn't told her. In a hurry, the young lady asked the lady's mind for forgiveness and also said that she would accompany her to the room. Madame smiled and said that she did not need to do this because they should have dinner first. A moment later, Madame handed them a very sweet chocolate. She asked them to eat it, as she knew it would make them a little more energetic. She said that they could snack on the chocolate and then accompany her to the kitchen. Dalen thanked Madame with a joyful smile and also said that she would be happy to eat it. The young man, in turn, also thanked Madame. Dalen knew that a dessert from a professional chef was something special. She understood perfectly well that you couldn't try something like this even for money. Opening the candy, she handed it to the young gentleman and told him to open his mouth. He froze for a moment. She looked at him in confusion and asked if he didn't want to eat. She quietly asked if there was poison in there. Kel said there was no poison in there. He froze for a moment and said that he had never smelled anything like it, so he couldn't tell if it was food. She froze for a moment and was taken aback, as she realized that she had hardly ever tasted anything sweet during the war. She looked at him with a smile and said that this treat smells amazing. She smiled and said that he should see since she wanted to try it first. A moment later, the young lady took a bite. He looked closely at her beautiful, plump lips. A moment later, she choked. He looked at her with bewilderment. But at that very moment, the young lady looked at the young man with a joyful smile and said that it was very tasty and he should try it. She said with a joyful smile that it was also the first time in her life that she had eaten something so delicious. He looked at her in surprise, as he was struck by her delightful smile. A moment later, Dalian held the candy out to him and said he should try it too. The young man stared at her for a moment, not daring to do anything. She smiled, looking at him with her outstretched candy in her hands. The lady looked at them in bewilderment and said that there were a lot of sweets in the house, and they did not have to eat just one. She looked at them closely and was puzzled, said that they could have taken the whole one. The young lady in turn was puzzled, because Anna just wanted to be friends. Sometime later, they were sitting at a table with a whole mountain of desserts in front of them. Madame looked at them with a smile and said that she would bring them lunch soon. Dalen, in turn, looked closely at these treats, because she knew that one such plate would cost a month of her family's budget. She was glad, because she knew that she was now experiencing pleasant feelings, because she could remove her desires at someone else's expense. Kells looked closely at the young lady and said with bewilderment that he saw dirt on the table. She was a little puzzled as she saw his agitated look. She sighed heavily and said with a smile that he was just not used to it yet, but as soon as he tried it, he would understand everything. At that very moment, the young man slowly reached for the cake. He was taken aback when he raised his hand, because he was dirty and some kind of incomprehensible mucus was flowing from his hand. She smiled and said that nothing terrible had happened, since chocolate usually melts or sticks. She ran away because it was the first time in his life that he had tried something like this, and she forgot to tell him that desserts were eaten with cutlery. She realized that there was one more thing that she needed to teach the young man. Dalen, with a happy smile, she gave him a piece of cake and said that it would taste better if she fed it to him. A moment later, she dipped a small piece of cake into the chocolate, and with a smile, handed the delicacy to the young man. She said with a smile that he should try the exquisite delicacy. Dalen looked at the young man with a satisfied smile, because she knew that their wild puppy had also become completely tame. She knew it was very sweet, but he was very slow, so she didn't push the piece of pie into his mouth with her lightning speed. She looked at him intently and said that now he had to live everything carefully. Dalen stared at the young man for a moment. She sighed heavily and asked if he really didn't like it. She asked if he really didn't like it at all, but also said that if he didn't like it, he could spit it out. He sighed heavily as his teeth were clenching, his arms were tingling, and his legs were tingling. He had never felt anything like this before. It felt like an outstretched hand. In that hand, there is usually something unfamiliar and strange. Warm light, necessary things, unusual food. The young lady, in turn, noticed that he had eaten everything, and happily said that it was very good, since she wanted to pick out some more desserts for him so that he could compare them. He looked at these desserts with bewilderment and disbelief. She smiled and said that they were very tasty. Dalen, with their lightning speed, various delicious desserts and fed the young man. Until now, he didn't understand what was tasty and what wasn't, but when she gave him something to eat, he took everything. Then she smiled. He knew that a smile is good. He saw that the corners of his eyes and lips were twitching slightly, and his breathing was becoming uneven. He unconsciously reached for his face. At that very moment, the young lady said that he just smiled a little. She was very happy about this and told her that sweets improved his mood. She looked at him with a smile and asked if he understood it, because she knew that it was called sweet. He looked at her shyly and smiled slightly. Dalen looked at the young man with a smile and asked him to eat something else, if, of course, he wanted it. And she also asked him to wipe his hands. After some time, the cook successfully adapted to the mansion, so she prepared various delicacies for them. The young men, in turn, had also become very accustomed to her. Madame smiled and said that she had provided them with fried lobster and turkey for lunch today, and that for an appetizer, she had made a vegetable salad and potato soup with croutons, and for dessert, she had prepared them strawberry pudding and chocolate cake. Dalen didn't understand the point of appetizers, because now just the sight of the cook made her hungry. Madame looked closely at the young people and said that they should start eating right away, and if they needed more, they could tell her. Dalen thanked Madame with joy for such a feast, but she noticed that this time the portions were larger than usual. Madame smiled and said that there would be one more person today. At the same moment, the Lord with his joyful smile said that it was a very good lunch. Dalen was shocked, as she did not expect to see him. She froze in surprise and asked when he had managed to come. He smiled a puzzled smile and said that since the two of them had not noticed him at all and were staring only at the cook, she looked at her charge in surprise and said that he should have told her about it since she did not notice him. But he turned his gaze away from her and did not answer, as he was jealous of her. The Lord looked closely at the young people and said with a satisfied smile that it seemed they had adapted perfectly to the life of their cooks, and now they could gradually increase the number of staff. But at that very moment, the young gentleman said that he did not want this. The Lord looked at the young master with tears in his eyes, because he said, "I don't want to." But at the same time, he didn't throw anything and behaved calmly. Kels looked at the Lord intently and told him not to bring people, as he did not want this, and he also did not want the Lord to come to them. Lauren, in turn, was very happy, as the young man spoke to him normally. Dalen sighed and looked closely at the young people, as she saw that each of them was ignoring the interlocutor, but she, in turn, was very worried, as she understood that the cook fit well into their little tandem. She saw that the cook was very quiet, slow, and just worked. She was enthusiastically cooking, but was not at all interested in them. She did not leave the room except for mealtimes. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that this was simply ideal, but ideal means rare. She knew that a beauty salon was especially such a place, since the ladies were the leaders of service. They were creative souls and masters of small talk. She did not know whether it was possible to leave a young man in such a place. She was most worried about something else. The Lord looked at her closely and said with a smile that she didn't need to worry so much. She looked at him with a joyful smile and asked if he had picked the others who were as perfect as the cook. He looked at her puzzledly and, hesitating, said that it was not so. The Lord sighed heavily and said with a smile that they didn't need to worry anyway, since it was all pointless, so they could start eating. The next day, the one she was most worried about came. The young lady looked at her client with a joyful smile and asked if he had any style wishes. Dalen, in turn, was in shock and didn't know what to do with something like this. At that very moment, she rushed to the hairdresser and stopped her. Madame was in shock and asked about the young lady why she reached for the scissors with her bare hands, since it was very dangerous. Dalen, holding scissors in her hand, said, puzzled, that she had previously reported that blades were not allowed, as their master had bad memories associated with sharp objects. Madame smiled and said that she had made a mistake because she had completely forgotten about it. But a moment later, she smiled and said that she had brought special scissors, especially for them, which were made in such a way as not to frighten a person at all. She looked intently at the young man, asking if he was comfortable with such scissors. He looked at the scissors in surprise, and his anger eased a little. The madam smiled and said that she had just felt relieved because the young master liked her scissors. Dalen looked closely at the young man because she saw that his soul would be sucked dry. She was surprised, but at the same time glad that he calmed down. And at that very moment, the madame began her work. Dalen, looking at them, wondered what would happen in the end. She knew that now his appearance was impeccable, but a moment later she threw all thoughts away, as the thoughts she had given away took her breath away. After a few seconds they got the result, but they were shocked and blinded by its beauty, as everything turned out even better. The young man, in turn, appeared before them in all his glory. Dalen thought she had gotten used to Kelsey's beauty, but it turned out there was another level above that. She knew it was moments like these that people raise children for. Madame shouted with joy, because she had succeeded and was pleased with her result. She shouted to the young lady that she had done it, and even the gods would be amazed by such beauty. She shouted that she had definitely become a hairdresser for this day, but at the same time she shook the young lady with all her might and joy.